I have a daughter. She's 4. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. 5 words. That's all it took to detonate 4 years of carefully constructed silence. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing who's in the room with me when I tell these stories. Now, let's get into it. Alara Calloway watched the color leave Callum Reed's face the way winter strips leaves from a tree. Fast, complete, irreversible. His jaw didn't drop. His eyes didn't go wide. He simply stilled, like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and hadn't hit the ground yet. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. In the shower, in the car, at 3 a.m., while Lila slept in the next room, her small chest rising and falling without a care in the world. She had rehearsed it and thrown away every version because none of them ever felt survivable. And now, here it was, happening. In a conference room she hadn't even wanted to walk into. Her hands stayed flat on the table, still, controlled, because if they shook, he'd know just how terrified she was. 4 years ago she had woken up to silence, not the comfortable kind, the kind that tells you, before you even open your eyes, that something is wrong, the kind that has weight to it, heavy, deliberate, final. The Boston Meridian Hotel, room 412. She remembered the number because she had stared at it for a long time before sliding the keycard in, telling herself she wasn't the kind of woman who did things like this. Turned out she was exactly that kind of woman, at least for one night. Callum had been at the conference too. Different company, same industry. They had argued over cocktails about market strategy, and somewhere between the second drink and the fourth, arguing had shifted into something else entirely. She hadn't planned it. She doubted he had either, but she had woken up to an empty bed. The sheets on his side were cold. His jacket, gone. His shoes, gone. The room held no trace of him except the faint scent of his cologne on the pillow she had already turned face down before she fully understood why. There was a note on the nightstand. 4 words. Sorry, this was a mistake. And beneath it, a $20 bill, folded once, left there like a tip. Like she was someone whose time needed compensating for. She had sat with that $20 bill in her hand for a long time. Not crying. She hadn't cried. She had simply sat there, feeling something inside her go very, very quiet. The part of her that had, for one reckless night, allowed herself to feel something. She left the 20 on the nightstand. She didn't touch it. 3 weeks later, she found out she was pregnant. And she made a decision she had lived with every single day since. The conference room felt smaller now. That was the only way Alara could describe it. The walls hadn't moved, the ceiling hadn't dropped, the long glass table between them hadn't shifted an inch, but the room had contracted around that single sentence, squeezing out all the air until breathing required actual effort. Callum hadn't spoken. He was still looking at her, and she was still looking at him, and somewhere in the space between them, the math was happening. She could see it. 4 years ago. Boston. One night. A daughter. 4 years old. He was counting backward, and the numbers were landing exactly where she knew they would. She had spent 4 years building a life that didn't require his presence in it. A small apartment on the east side, a job she was good at, a daughter who laughed like the world had never once been cruel to her. Alara had constructed every piece of it with deliberate, quiet intention, a life that was whole without him. And then, Callum Reed had walked into this interview as the hiring manager. She hadn't known. She needed that to be clear, even if only to herself. She had applied to Meridian Group 6 weeks ago because the position was right and the timing was right, and she had not once, not for a single moment, thought to check who sat on the other side of the table. Because why would she? He was supposed to be a stranger she had successfully forgotten. So, Alara, can I call you Alara? Greta Simmons, head of people operations, had the warm, efficient energy of someone who ran meetings on schedule and never once noticed when a room was on fire. She was shuffling through her copy of the resume now, reading glasses pushed up her nose, pen clicking in a steady rhythm. She hadn't looked up. She hadn't noticed Callum's stillness or Alara's rigid posture. or the silence that had stretched 3 seconds too long before Ilara managed a quiet, "Yes, of course." "Wonderful. So, your background is primarily in financial restructuring, which is exactly what drew us to your application." Greta made a small, approving sound. "Callum, didn't you say her portfolio work was impressive?" Callum said nothing. Greta glanced up, briefly, then back down. "Right. Well." She pressed on, the way professional people do when they've decided a pause isn't their problem to address. "The role would have you working closely with our senior leadership team, so we like to understand how candidates handle high-pressure environments. Can you walk us through a situation where you had to make a difficult decision under significant time pressure?" Ilara answered the question. She didn't know how. Somewhere in her mind, words assembled themselves into coherent sentences and exited her mouth in the correct order. She could hear herself speaking from a very great distance, because across the table, Callum Reed had not moved, had not spoken, and had not stopped looking at her. He stood up without warning. No clearing of his throat, no polite excuse. Callum simply pushed his chair back, the legs catching against the floor with a sound sharp enough to make Greta stop mid-sentence. "Excuse me?" His voice was controlled, professionally controlled, the kind of control that costs something to maintain. He gathered his portfolio folder, buttoned his jacket with one clean motion, and looked directly at Greta. "I need to step out for a moment. Please continue." Greta blinked. Of course, absolutely. But he was already at the door, and just before he stepped through it, he paused. He didn't turn around fully, just enough. His eyes found Ilara across the length of the room, and what was in them wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something colder than anger, something that had moved past the hot, reactive stage and settled into something far more deliberate. "Ms. Calloway." His voice was quiet, precise, the kind of quiet that fills a room more completely than shouting ever could. A word. After. It wasn't a question. Greta smiled pleasantly, completely unaware that the interview had just become the least important thing happening in this room. Ilara looked down at her hands. They were shaking. If you're feeling what Ilara is feeling right now, that specific dread of a past you thought you'd outrun stepping right back into your present, stay with me, because this story is only just beginning. Make sure you're subscribed so you catch every part as it drops, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Ilara made the right call keeping Lila a secret? I want to know where you stand before this thing goes further. Greta gathered her folders with the brisk, cheerful efficiency of someone who had back-to-back meetings and absolutely no idea she had just left 2 people alone in a room with 4 years of unfinished business between them. "I'll give you both a moment," she said, already moving toward the door. "Callum mentioned he had a few additional questions for you. Very standard stuff. Can I get anyone water? Coffee?" Neither of them answered. Greta left anyway. The door clicked shut behind her, and the sound of it was somehow louder than it should have been. Ilara stayed in her seat. She didn't look up. She listened to Greta's heels fade down the corridor until there was nothing left but the low hum of the building's ventilation system and the specific, loaded silence of a room that held 2 people who both knew what was coming, and neither was ready for. He said her name. Just that. Nothing before it, nothing after it. One word. 4 years of silence compressed into it like a stone dropped into still water. Ilara. She had heard her name said 1,000 different ways over the years. By colleagues who needed something from her. By Lila in the mornings, high and bright, and still half asleep. By her mother, who loaded it with worry. But the way Callum said it now, low, careful, like he was testing whether it still fit, was a way she had never heard from anyone else. She made herself look at him. He was standing near the window. His jacket was still on, his posture still composed, but his hands. She noticed his hands. They were pressed flat against the surface of the conference table, and the knuckles were pale. He wasn't as composed as he looked. "I need you to talk to me." His voice was steady, but it cost him. She could hear exactly how much it cost him. Not for the job, not for any of that. "I need you to talk to me right now, as 2 people who—" He stopped, started again. "Is she mine?" 3 words, and the world reduced itself to the space between them. Elara had imagined this question in the dark, in the quiet, in the moments between Lila's bedtime and her own, when she would sit on the edge of her bed and think about all the versions of this conversation she would never have. She had rehearsed answers, reasonable ones, measured ones, ones that were honest without being cruel, firm without being cold. Every single one of them dissolved the moment the question actually landed. She opened her mouth, closed it. Callum hadn't moved from the window. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully name. Not anger, not hope, not grief. Something that was all three at once, held in a face that had learned, very well, how to show nothing. Is she mine, Elara? Quieter this time, and somehow that was worse, because the first time sounded like a demand, and this time sounded like a man who already suspected he knew the answer and was giving her one last opportunity to be the one to say it out loud. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the jaw she had once found unbearably attractive, at the eyes that were the same shade as her daughter's, at the specific angle of his nose that Lila had inherited so completely that strangers sometimes asked Elara which side of the family it came from. She exhaled. Yes. She had expected anger, immediate, loud, righteous anger, the kind that would make this easier, the kind she could push back against. What she got was silence. Then, something shifted in Callum's face. Not dramatically, not in the way people collapse in films, with falling to knees and breaking voices. It was smaller than that, more devastating for being small. His jaw loosened. His shoulders dropped a single inch. His eyes, which had been hard and focused and controlled, went somewhere else entirely for just a moment, somewhere private, somewhere she wasn't supposed to see. He turned away from her, walked to the window, stood there with his back to the room, one hand pressed against the glass, looking out at the city below like the view might hold something useful. She kept talking because the silence was unbearable. Her name is Lila. She turned 4 in March. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, in some distant, exhausted way. She's healthy, she's good, she's the best thing I have ever done, and I need you to know that before you say anything else. Whatever you're feeling right now, whatever you want to accuse me of, she is happy, and she is loved, and she has lacked nothing. He still hadn't turned around. I made a decision, Elara continued. I won't pretend it was easy. I won't pretend I was certain. But I made it, and I made it alone, because that's what I had to work with. You left, Callum. You left, and you didn't look back, and I wasn't going to chase a man who had made his feelings perfectly clear with $20 and 4 words. He turned around then. His eyes were red at the rims. You should have told me. His voice came out rough at the edges, like something had scraped against it on the way out. Regardless of what happened in that room, regardless of what I did, you should have told me. How? The word came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't pull it back. You didn't leave a number, Callum. You didn't leave a last name on the conference registration. You left a note and cash and an empty room. What exactly was I supposed to do? Post a notice? You could have found me. People find people. You clearly found this company well enough to apply. I did not know you worked here. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it. I want that on record. I looked up the position, I researched Meridian Group, I applied for a role I was qualified for. Your name was not on the job posting. He dragged a hand through his hair. So this was just, what, coincidence? Apparently. A beat of silence. Then, you still should have tried. And you should never have left. She stood now, because she couldn't deliver this sitting down. You want to talk about what people should have done? Let's talk. You should have stayed, or at minimum left something that made it possible to find you. You should have been someone worth finding. Instead, you left $20 on a nightstand and disappeared. So don't stand there in a $3,000 suit and tell me about my obligations. He said nothing. She pressed forward. I was 27 and alone and pregnant, and I made a choice. I chose to have her, and I chose to raise her, and I chose to do it without the involvement of a man who had made it very clear he wanted nothing to do with what happened between us. You don't get to rewrite that history now just because you're standing in front of me. I'm not trying to rewrite anything. His voice had gone very quiet. I'm trying to understand. You had 4 years to try to understand. You had 4 years where you were out there, living your life, not once wondering. I thought about that night, he said. Flat, certain, more than you know. The room went still again. Lila, he said the name, the way someone tries out a word in a language they're just beginning to learn. Carefully, with enormous weight. Yes, I want to meet her. The sentence was simple. 4 words. But it landed like a door being thrown open that Alara had spent 4 years keeping shut, and everything in her rose up against it at once. Every late night, every grocery run alone, every parent-teacher form where she had left the second line blank. She looked at him with eyes that had run completely out of softness. You don't get to walk back into my life and demand access to hers. She didn't hear from anyone for 2 days. Not from Greta, not from Callum, not a follow-up email, not a standard acknowledgement of interview response. Nothing, just silence, which under ordinary circumstances she would have read as a polite rejection and moved on from. These were not ordinary circumstances. She went through the motions of those 48 hours with the precision of someone running on very little sleep and a great deal of controlled panic. She dropped Lila at daycare. She answered emails for the consulting work she had been stretching like a worn elastic band for the past 6 months. She made dinner. She loaded the dishwasher. She sat on her couch at 10:15 at night with a cup of tea she forgot to drink, staring at her phone like it had personally wronged her. The job was good. The salary was real. The position was exactly the kind of move she had been trying to make for 2 years. And Callum Reed was the chief strategy officer of the company offering it. She turned her phone face down, then turned it back over, then put it in a drawer. It didn't help. The call came on a Thursday morning at 9:47, while Alara was standing in her kitchen in yesterday's socks, trying to remember if she had eaten breakfast. Alara, it's Greta Simmons from Meridian Group. I hope this is a good time. It was not a good time. It was an extraordinarily complicated time. But she said, of course, and pressed her back against the kitchen counter and made herself breathe. We've completed our review process, and I'm absolutely delighted to extend you a formal offer for the Senior Financial Restructuring Lead position. Your interview was exceptional. The panel was genuinely impressed with your portfolio analysis, and we believe you'd be a tremendous asset to the team. Alara closed her eyes. Greta continued with the specifics: salary, benefits, start date, reporting structure. The numbers were better than expected. The role was everything she had positioned herself toward for the last 3 years. Greta spoke with the warm efficiency of someone who had delivered enough good news to have a smooth, practiced rhythm for it. We'd love to have you on board, ideally starting the 2nd week of next month, if that works for your timeline. Alara looked around her apartment. At the stack of bills on the counter, she had reorganized twice without paying. At the drawing Lila had taped to the refrigerator, a purple figure that was supposed to be Alara, with very large hands. I'm interested, she said. Can I have until end of day to confirm? Absolutely. Take your time. A brief pause. I do want to mention one thing. Callum Reed has formally recused himself from any involvement in your onboarding and direct performance review process. Given that you'd be operating within his division, we've restructured your reporting line to sit directly with the executive committee. I want you to know that's already been taken care of, and it won't affect your scope of role in any way. Alara said, I appreciate you telling me. She kept her voice level, professional, the way she had trained herself to sound when something had caught her completely off guard. After she hung up, she stood in the kitchen for a long time. He had recused himself. He had gone to HR, or to someone with the authority to restructure a reporting line, and had voluntarily removed himself from the equation. She didn't know what to do with that information. Part of her was relieved. Part of her found it infuriating, because it meant he had thought this through, had made moves she wasn't aware of, had been 3 steps ahead while she spent 2 days staring at a silent phone. She hated how much it looked like consideration. She didn't want him to be considerate. That night, after dinner and bath time and 2 rounds of a story about a rabbit who wanted to be an astronaut, Alara stood in the doorway of Lila's room and watched her sleep. She did this sometimes, not every night. Just the nights when the world felt too large and too complicated, and she needed something to remind her what all the hard work was actually for. Lila slept the way 4-year-olds sleep, completely, unguardedly, one arm thrown over her eyes like the ceiling light might surprise her. She had Ilara's hair and Callum's nose, and a laugh that belonged entirely to herself, and she was, without question, the single most important thing in Ilara's world. Ilara crossed the room quietly and sat on the edge of the bed. She rested her hand lightly on Lila's back, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. "I'm going to take the job," she whispered, not to herself, to Lila. She had always talked to Lila like she could hear the things that mattered, even when she was asleep, even when she was too small to understand. Old habit. Good habit. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know how to navigate what's coming. But it's a better future. For you, for us, and that's the only calculation that has ever made sense to me. She leaned down, pressed her lips to Lila's hair. "I promise, I'll keep you safe, no matter what." She accepted the offer at 11:53 that night, typed the email 3 times before she sent it, deleted words like delighted and thrilled because they felt dishonest, and settled on pleased to accept and look forward to contributing, which were true in the specific, careful way that true things sometimes have to be. She set her phone down and sat with the decision. The career case was straightforward. She was running out of runway on her freelance work. The salary difference was significant, and the role itself was the kind of opportunity she had spent years building toward. Professionally, this was not a difficult call. The complication was the man whose office she would be operating in proximity to, the man who now knew he had a daughter. The man who had, in the span of one hallway conversation, gone from a memory she had sealed away to an active variable in her life with no clear trajectory. She didn't know what Callum wanted. She didn't know what he was planning. She didn't know if his recusal was strategy or sincerity, or both. But she had made her decision. Whatever came next, she would handle it. She always had. The building was called Meridian Global Tower, but everyone who worked there just called it the Glass House. 42 floors of steel and reflective surface that caught the morning light in a way that was either beautiful or aggressive depending on the direction you were coming from. Ilara came from the east. She arrived 12 minutes early, which was how she always arrived at things that mattered, early enough to compose herself, not so early it looked like she was nervous. She wore the charcoal blazer she had dry cleaned specifically for today and carried a leather portfolio that had been a gift to herself after her first major contract win. Small anchors, things that reminded her she had built something solid before today and would continue building after it. The lobby was all marble and motion, people moving in and out with the focused energy of those who knew exactly where they were going. She gave her name at reception, collected her access badge, and stood for a moment looking at her own photo on the lanyard. Ilara Calloway, Senior Financial Restructuring Lead. She clipped it to her lapel. She was here. Whatever that meant, she was here. Greta was waiting for her at the elevator bank on the ground floor, which Ilara had not expected and appreciated more than she could say. "First days are overwhelming even when you're senior," Greta said, by way of greeting. "I like to do the first elevator ride personally. Sets the tone." She pressed the button for the 31st floor. The doors closed. "I appreciate that. I also want to say something, briefly and professionally, before we get into the building's orientation." Greta didn't look at her. She faced the doors, hands clasped, tone even. "Callum Reed is well respected here. He's been with Meridian for 3 years, and his leadership of the strategy division has been exceptional. I don't know the nature of whatever history exists between the two of you, and it genuinely isn't my business to know." Ilara kept her expression neutral. "What is my business," Greta continued, "is ensuring that this team functions. You were hired because you are qualified, full stop. The restructuring of your reporting line was handled cleanly, and no one on your team has been given any context beyond a standard organizational note. So as far as the floor is concerned, you're a new senior lead, and that's the entirety of your introduction." "I understand, and I have no intention of making it anything other than that." Greta finally looked at her, and for the first time, the professional warmth shifted just slightly to reveal something more direct underneath. "Good, because you're genuinely talented, Ilara. Your interview work was some of the strongest I've seen this cycle. It would be a waste for this to become anything other than what it should be, a good career move. The elevator opened on 31. "Welcome to the glass house," Greta said, stepping out. "Try the coffee on this floor. It's better than 32. Her office was good, corner adjacent, with a window that looked southeast over the financial district. A clean desk, a new monitor still in the manufacturer's default settings, a small plant on the windowsill that someone had remembered to water recently. These were the kinds of details that told you a company was organized. She set her portfolio down and turned to take in the full room. That's when she saw it. Directly across the open corridor, glass-walled on both sides, the kind of transparent architecture that was designed to communicate openness and collaboration, was another office, larger than hers, a dark wood desk, a wall of bookshelves, a city view that stretched further than hers by a visible margin, and on the door, in clean matte lettering, C. Reed, Chief Strategy Officer. She stood, very still. She thought about Greta's careful, professional speech in the elevator. She thought about the recusal, the clean organizational note, the nobody has context assurance. She thought about all the tidy, well-managed arrangements that had been made, and then she thought about the fact that whoever had arranged those things had apparently not thought to address the fact that she and Callum would be able to see directly into each other's offices with nothing but a corridor and 2 sheets of glass between them. She turned back to her desk. She opened her laptop. She told herself it was fine. It was absolutely not fine. He arrived at 8:43. She knew because she heard the floor shift slightly, the subtle change in ambient energy that a building gets when someone significant walks in, and then she heard nothing, which meant he had seen her already. She kept her eyes on her screen. She was reviewing a restructuring brief that had been sent to her overnight, the kind of dense, detailed document that under normal circumstances would have her full and immediate attention. This morning it was taking every deliberate effort she had to process the words in the correct order. She felt the look before she confirmed it. When she finally glanced up, casually, the way you glance up when you're simply resting your eyes from a screen, Callum was standing at the entrance of his office, jacket on, coffee in hand, watching her with an expression that was impossible to read at this distance and through glass, but was communicating something regardless. She held the look for exactly 3 seconds. Then she dropped her eyes back to the screen. She heard his office door open, then close. The glass didn't block sound as well as it blocked everything else. Her team met her at 9. There were 6 of them, gathered in the small conference room 2 doors down from her office. Greta made the introductions with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times, and Ilara watched each face as they settled in. Marcus, senior analyst, early 30s, sharp eyes, the kind of professionally polite that could mean anything. He had clearly been the informal lead while the position was vacant, and the way he sat at the table suggested he hadn't entirely decided how he felt about no longer being that. Priya, data lead, warm, immediate, the one who offered Ilara coffee before anyone else thought to. Ilara filed her under ally potential with a mental note not to assume too much too soon. James and Yemi, both analysts, quiet, watching, absorbing, the kind of professionals who form opinions early and share them late. Good team members if you earned them. Complicated if you didn't. Danny, the coordinator, the youngest, organized in the way that only people who are slightly terrified of disorder tend to be, color-coded notebook, pen, already in hand. And Rowan, the senior consultant who Ilara would later learn had applied for her role and not moved forward in the process. That one she noticed immediately. Not because Rowan was hostile. He wasn't. Not overtly. It was the particular quality of his pleasantness. Too even, too considered. The smile that didn't quite reach the specific place. Smiles go when they're genuine. She knew that look. She had managed people for 8 years. That was the look of someone taking stock, waiting, deciding how much effort it was worth to be difficult. She made a note of it and moved on. She introduced herself simply, her background, her approach, her expectations for the first 30 days. She was direct without being cold, clear without being rigid. By the end of the meeting, she had the measure of 5 out of 6. The 6th she would need to watch. And then her laptop, open on the conference table, lit up with a notification, a new email, internal sender. Read. She didn't open it in front of the team. She closed the laptop with a smooth, unhurried motion and wrapped up the meeting with the same steady composure she had maintained since 8:15 that morning, answered 2 questions from Priya about timeline priorities and walked back to her office. Closed the door. Opened the laptop. The email was exactly what she expected, and nothing she was prepared for. Miss Calloway, I'd like to request a brief meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss a personal matter that falls outside the scope of current work assignments. Please let me know your availability. Read. Formal, cold, almost aggressively professional. Every word chosen for its neutrality. There was nothing in it that could be flagged, screenshot, or misread by a third party, which meant he had thought about that. She read it twice, closed the laptop again, and sat back in her chair. She could ignore it. That was the first option, and she spent a few minutes honestly entertaining it. He had recused himself from her professional review. Technically, she was under no obligation to attend a meeting he requested that was explicitly labeled personal. She could reply with something brief and impenetrable. I'm fully focused on onboarding this week, perhaps we can revisit later. And let that sit there as a boundary, politely worded, professionally unassailable. The problem was later. Later was not a wall. Later was a delay. And Callum Reid had not gotten to Chief Strategy Officer at 34 by accepting delays from people who were physically 40 feet away from him 8 hours a day. If she didn't engage, he would find another way to engage. That was simply the math of the situation, and she was too good with numbers to pretend otherwise. She could confront it. Walk across the corridor right now. Knock on the glass door. Get whatever this was over with in the daylight where it couldn't grow into something worse in the silence between them. But that felt like conceding something, like letting him set the pace and the terms. She needed to respond on her own timeline. Her choice, her conditions. She opened the laptop again, hovered over the reply button. And before she could talk herself out of anything, her mind pulled her somewhere else entirely. Boston, 5 years ago, the conference where everything started. She hadn't wanted to go. That was the part she always came back to when she let herself think about it. The Global Finance and Strategy Summit in Boston had been her manager's suggestion, borderline requirement, and Alara had spent 2 weeks trying to find a professional reason to avoid it. She was mid-project. The travel was inconvenient. She had a dinner to get to on the Thursday. None of it was compelling enough. She went. The first time she saw Callum Reid, he was wrong. Not wrong in the way people are wrong before you know them. Wrong in the way that gets under your skin. He was presenting a market repositioning framework to a room of 40. Analysts and he had gotten something fundamentally incorrect about risk depreciation in volatile sectors, and she had known it immediately, and she had put her hand up. He had not looked pleased. You're assuming linear depreciation, she said, from the 4th row. That model doesn't hold in the kind of volatility you're describing. Your risk window is narrower than your slide suggests by at least a quarter. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms do when someone says something that is either very right or very wrong. Callum had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd looked back at his slide. Then he'd said, quietly, she's right. We adjust at the break. They had argued for 3 hours at the hotel bar that evening. And somewhere around the 2nd hour, the argument had stopped being about risk modeling. He was quick, genuinely quick, in the way that only people who think for themselves rather than reciting frameworks tend to be. He listened when she spoke, not waiting for his turn, actually listening, following the thread of what she said and pulling at it with real curiosity. She had found it disarming in a way she wasn't practiced at handling. The first night they talked until 2 in the morning and went to their separate rooms. The second night they talked until 1, and the conversation followed her back to her door. The third night, she stopped pretending she wasn't aware of him every time he walked into a room. What happened wasn't reckless. It didn't feel reckless. It felt like the most honest thing she had done in years. That was the part that made what came next so difficult to absorb. She had woken at 6:42, not from a noise, from the absence of one. The room had a particular quality to its silence, the kind that tells you in the first half second of consciousness that you're alone in it. She had lain there for a moment before confirming what she already knew. Then she had sat up. His side of the bed was cold. On the nightstand, a folded note. Beneath it, a $20 bill. The note said 4 words. Sorry, this was a mistake. She had read it once. She hadn't read it again. She didn't need to. Some sentences have the particular quality of being complete. They say everything they intend to say and leave no room for alternate interpretation. She had gotten dressed, packed her bag, checked out of the hotel. She had not cried, which surprised her. She had felt something that was colder than crying and more permanent. The specific feeling of having let herself be open and finding out, in the clearest possible terms, that it had been a poor investment. She had gone home. She had moved forward. 23 days later, she had taken a pregnancy test. She came back to the present slowly. The laptop screen had dimmed while she sat there. She moved the mouse, and it came back to life. The email from C. Reed still open in front of her. She thought about the $20 bill. She thought about Lila asleep in her small bed, one arm over her face, breathing steadily into a world she had no idea was about to get more complicated. She thought about the fact that she had walked into this building this morning on her own terms, and she intended to stay on them. She opened the reply window, typed for 40 seconds, deleted 3 drafts. On the 4th attempt, she wrote, "Mr. Reed, I'm available for a brief meeting. Given the nature of the matter, I'd suggest keeping this after hours to avoid any perception of crossover with work business. I can do tomorrow at 6 if that works." She didn't sign it warmly. She didn't add anything softening. She read it twice for professionalism, once for tone, and once to make sure nothing in it could be mistaken for willingness beyond what she was actually offering. Then she hit send. 3 seconds later, his reply arrived. "Tomorrow, 6 p.m., my office." By 6 o'clock, the 31st floor was nearly empty. The open-plan desks had been abandoned to screensavers and cold coffee cups. The corridor lights had shifted to their lower evening setting, the kind of light that makes a familiar space look slightly different, quieter, stripped of its daytime purpose. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. Ilara stood outside Callum's door at 5:58. She had told herself she wouldn't arrive early. She had come early anyway because the alternative was standing in the elevator lobby, talking herself out of leaving, and that seemed worse. She could see him through the glass. He was at his desk, jacket still on, reading something on his screen. He hadn't noticed her yet. Or if he had, he was giving her the time. She knocked once. He looked up, stood, crossed the office, and opened the door himself, rather than calling out. "Thank you for coming," he said, and the professionalism of it was almost strange. Like they were beginning a negotiation both of them had agreed to conduct in a language neither of them actually spoke. She walked in. He closed the door behind her. He didn't go back to his desk. That surprised her. She had expected the desk, the physical barrier of it, the authority it would lend him. Instead, he moved to the small seating area at the far end of the office. 2 chairs angled toward each other near the window, and gestured toward one of them, with the careful neutrality of someone who had thought about how this meeting should feel. She sat. He sat. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the space between them for a moment before looking at her. "I've been thinking about what to say since you left that conference room," he began. "I've written it and rewritten it, and I've arrived at the conclusion that there's no version of this that doesn't require me to simply be honest. So that's what I'm going to try to do." She said nothing. She gave him nothing to work with or work against, just attention. "I know that what I did that morning in Boston was... I know it was cruel. I want you to know I understand that. The note, the way I left, I've thought about it for 5 years, Ilara, and I've never found a version of it I could fully defend, because there isn't one. What I did was unkind, and you deserved better than that, and I am genuinely sorry for it." She kept her face still. "I need you to know the apology isn't contingent on anything that comes after it. It's not a setup for a request. I'm not saying sorry as a strategy. I'm saying it because I have owed you that specific thing for 5 years, and you have never been in front of me long enough for me to say it until now." She considered that for a moment. "All right," she said finally. Not acceptance, not dismissal. Just acknowledgement that he had spoken, and she had heard him. He seemed to understand the difference. "There's something I need to explain," he said then, "about why I left, about what was happening before Boston and during it, and what I did afterward. I'm not asking you to receive it as an excuse, but I think you deserve the full truth, because you have been making decisions in the absence of it, and that's partly my fault." She looked at him steadily. "Then explain." He was quiet for a moment, choosing the entry point. "When I went to Boston," he said, "I was engaged." The word landed cleanly. No softening, no preamble. She gave him credit for that much. Her name was Charlotte. We'd been together for 4 years, engaged for 8 months. It wasn't a bad relationship. She was a good person. We made sense on paper, which I think is exactly the problem I hadn't let myself look at directly. We made sense on paper, and I had made peace with that being enough. Elara said nothing. Boston was supposed to be a 3-day conference. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't in the habit of. What happened between us was not something I had planned or wanted to want, and when it happened I didn't handle it honestly. I panicked. He said the word with the specific, flat acceptance of someone naming something they've already examined from every angle. "I woke up before you that morning, and I looked at you, and I knew that what I had just done was going to cost someone something, and I chose to protect the thing I'd already built, instead of dealing with what I'd just felt. So I left. I wrote something that I knew was inadequate, and I walked out, and I got on a train back, and I told myself that was the end of it." She listened to all of it, without moving. There was something strange about hearing the inside of a moment you had only ever experienced from the outside. She had constructed her version of that morning over years, the story of a man who had wanted nothing and felt nothing, and had been honest enough with himself to communicate it in 4 words. This version was different. This version was a man who had felt something and been afraid of it, and made a coward's choice. She wasn't sure yet which version made her angrier. "You were engaged," she said. Flat. "Yes." "And you still—" "Yes." He didn't let her finish, and I have no defense for that. None. She stood up, not dramatically. She simply found that she could no longer have this conversation sitting down, because something in her had shifted, and it needed room. She walked to the window, stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the city the way he had looked out of the conference room window the week before, and she understood now why he'd done it. Sometimes you need something large and indifferent to look at while you get your bearings. You need to understand something. Her voice was level. She had made a decision about the level of her voice, and she intended to maintain it. "What happened in Boston? I wasn't naive about what it was. I knew it was a conference. I knew it wasn't a beginning. I wasn't expecting you to propose in the hotel lobby the next morning." She turned around. "But I believed I was making a choice about myself and about you. Not about myself, you, and a woman you had never mentioned who was at home believing she was going to marry you." Her jaw tightened at the edges. "You didn't just betray me, Callum. You involved me in something I had no knowledge of and no consent to be part of. That is a different category of wrong. You understand that, don't you?" He met her eyes. "Yes." "She deserved better. I deserved better. And you made every single decision for everyone in that situation without giving anyone else a vote." She exhaled, slow, controlled. "So don't sit there and tell me you panicked as if panic is an explanation. Panic is what happened. It's not what made it acceptable." He didn't argue. He didn't try to soften it. He sat with it, which was the only correct thing left to do. 2 weeks after Boston," he said, once the silence had run its course, "I ended the engagement." She looked at him. "I went home and I tried to go back to normal. I tried to carry on as though nothing had changed because I had convinced myself that was the responsible thing to do. But something had changed, not because of what happened between us specifically, or not only that. It was more that Boston made it impossible for me to keep pretending that good on paper was the same as good." He paused. "Charlotte deserved someone who was fully in it. I wasn't. I hadn't been for a while. I just hadn't been honest enough with myself to say so." "So you ended it?" "Yes." Elara processed this, let it sit in the room and breathe. Part of her had spent 5 years building a very specific architecture of that night. Clean lines, clear motives, simple conclusion. And he was standing here dismantling it piece by piece, not to exonerate himself, but because the actual shape of what happened was more complicated than her architecture allowed for. She didn't know how to feel about that yet. "If you ended the engagement," she said carefully, 2 weeks later, "I looked for you." He said it before she could finish, quietly, certainly, in the tone of someone saying something they have been holding for a very long time. 6 months, Ilara. I looked for you for 6 months. He leaned forward. You had vanished. If this story has you feeling every single one of those layers, the anger, the grief, the complicated truth underneath a simple betrayal, you are not alone. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything we thought we understood about both of them. Subscribe, so you don't miss a single part, and tell me in the comments, do you believe him? Is 6 months of looking enough, or is it 5 years too late? The apartment on Crescent Street was small in the way that things become small when they are filled with love. Not cramped, just alive. Every available surface had been quietly colonized by the evidence of a 4-year-old with opinions. Drawings taped to the refrigerator in overlapping layers. A collection of rocks arranged along the windowsill with the seriousness of a museum exhibit. 3 stuffed animals positioned at the kitchen table each morning, as though they too had somewhere to be. Ilara had moved here when Lila was 6 months old. Before that, she had been in a larger place across town. Cheaper in theory, more expensive in every way that mattered, in a building where the elevator broke twice a month and the neighbors played music until 2 in the morning. She had packed everything she owned into a rented van, driven herself and a sleeping infant across the city, and carried boxes up 2 flights of stairs while Lila slept in a carrier against her chest. She had not asked anyone for help. Not because help wasn't available. Her mother had offered, 2 friends had offered. She had thanked all of them and declined, because there was something she needed to prove to herself in that specific moment, that she was capable, that she was sufficient, that the life she was building would hold. It had held. It wasn't a glamorous life. The hallway light needed a new bulb. The kitchen tap ran a half-second slow. She couldn't afford the neighborhood she had initially wanted, and the preschool was a 20-minute commute rather than a 5-minute walk. But there were drawings on every surface and rocks on the windowsill and 3 stuffed animals at the breakfast table. It held. Lila woke up talking. Not gradually, not in stages. She went from asleep to fully verbal in approximately 4 seconds, which had been alarming when she was a baby and was now simply a fact of life Ilara had built her morning around. Mama, Mama, is it a school day? It's a school day. A pause while Lila evaluated this information. Can I have the yellow cup? You can have whatever cup you find. This was always the correct answer because Lila had very strong feelings about which cup she used, and the feelings changed daily, and the only way to navigate this without a negotiation that consumed 12 minutes was to make it her decision entirely. Breakfast was scrambled eggs and half a piece of toast, because Lila had decided 2 weeks ago that a whole piece of toast was too much toast, and Ilara had learned to prioritize the battles. Getting dressed was its own negotiation. Lila had developed a preference for the color purple that was somewhere between a fondness and a moral stance. She owned 4 purple items and had opinions about the rotation. The leggings or the dress? The leggings. With the star shirt? With the star shirt. Okay, good choice. This was also a technique. Tell a 4-year-old they've made a good choice, and they move forward with the energy of someone who has been trusted with real authority. Ilara had discovered this by accident when Lila was 2 and had been using it ever since. It happened over the eggs. Lila was pushing a piece around her plate in the idle, unfocused way she ate when something was moving through her mind, and Ilara was standing at the counter with her coffee, reviewing her schedule for the day, and the kitchen was quiet and warm and ordinary. Mama, Rosie at school has a daddy that picks her up on Wednesdays. Ilara set her coffee down. She did it slowly, buying herself nothing but the half-second it took. Does she? And Theo has a daddy who came on show day with a dog. Lila looked up. Her eyes were very direct for a 4-year-old. She had always been like this, the kind of child who looked you straight in the face when she wanted an answer, as if she understood already that eye contact made deflection harder. Do I have a daddy? There it was, not for the first time. The first time had been 7 months ago, a Tuesday, bath time. Ilara had answered it then, and the answer had satisfied Lila for 7 months, which was both longer and shorter than Ilara had expected. Everyone has a daddy, Ilara said carefully. That's how people get made. But where is mine? He lives somewhere else. Why? Because sometimes grown-ups live in different places. She moved to the table and crouched down to Lila's level. Do you remember what we talked about? About how families come in lots of different shapes. Like Grandma Nina lives in Florida and we still love her. Exactly like that. Lila considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to all major philosophical questions. Is my daddy nice? Ilara looked at her daughter's face, at the question sitting there, open and genuine and entirely without armor. I think so, she said. Yes. She sat down at the table properly then, because this deserved more than a crouching answer. Your daddy and I, we knew each other a long time ago, and then life took us to different places. That happens sometimes with grown-ups. It doesn't mean anything was wrong with you. You were the best thing that came from that time, and you are loved, very, very loved. By you? By me, every single day. And by the stuffed animals. Ilara felt the specific internal shift that happened when Lila said something that was both funny and so achingly innocent that it required a moment to absorb. Especially by the stuffed animals, she said. Lila nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to moving her eggs around. The conversation was over for her. Filed, processed, complete. For Ilara, it would stay all day. The preschool drop-off was its own small universe of morning chaos. Parents in varying states of alertness, children at various stages of willingness. Ilara watched a father swing his daughter up onto his shoulders in the car park, and the little girl shrieked with delight, legs kicking, face turned up to the sky. Lila had her backpack on and was already moving toward the gate, fully independent, fully unaware that her mother was standing still behind her, watching the father and daughter and holding something she had no clean name for. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Callum. She let it ring twice before she answered. Not because she was uncertain. She had known since the night in his office that this call was coming. She let it ring twice because she needed the 2 seconds. Callum. Ilara. Good morning. A pause. Is this an okay time? She was standing in the preschool car park, watching the last few parents file out through the gate. Morning air, exhaust fumes, someone's forgotten scarf draped over the fence. It's fine. Go ahead. I want to meet her. He said it directly. No preamble, no working up to it. She had expected this, too. I know what you said in the conference room. I heard you. I'm not coming at this with entitlement. I want you to know that before anything else. I'm not calling with a list of legal rights or a lawyer on the other line. I'm calling because I've thought about almost nothing else for 2 weeks, and I need you to know that this is a genuine request from me as a person. Ilara moved away from the gate, walked a few steps toward a quieter corner of the car park, her back to the street. You want to meet a 4-year-old who doesn't know you exist, she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. You understand what that means in practice, yes? This isn't a business meeting. This is a child. I know. Do you? A long pause. No, he admitted. Probably not completely. I can't just bring a strange man into her life and introduce him without context or preparation or... I'm not asking you to do it today. His voice was measured, but she could hear the weight behind it. The specific quality of someone keeping something larger under deliberate control. I'm not asking you to do it this week. I'm asking you to consider it. To not close the door before we've had the conversation. The conversation about what, exactly? About what you would be to her. Because I have not told her anything, Callum. She doesn't know your name. As far as she's concerned, her father is a person who exists somewhere else, and that answer has been enough for her. For now. Yes, for now. Which is all I can manage. Now. I cannot make decisions about 5 years from today based on a conversation we've had twice. That's fair. He said it without argument, which surprised her. It is fair, but Ilara, she's going to ask more questions, you know that. You know that the answers that work at 4 don't work at 7, and the answers at 7 don't hold at 12, and at some point she's going to want more than he lives somewhere else. I'm not using that as leverage. I'm saying it because it's true. She knew it was true. That was the problem. What exactly are you asking for? One meeting, controlled, wherever you're comfortable, whatever terms you set. You're present the entire time. You decide when it starts and when it ends. He exhaled. I will follow every rule you put on the table. And what do you get out of this arrangement? Because people don't offer to follow every rule without wanting something in return. Silence. I have a proposition, he said. If you allow me one meeting, one supervised on your terms, I'll have my lawyer draw up documentation that signs away any legal claim to paternity. Custody, visitation rights, financial obligation from my end, all of it. You would have full legal protection. She would be yours entirely, in every way the law recognizes. Elara stopped walking. You're serious? Completely. She stood very still in the corner of the car park, the morning moving around her, a bus pulling away from the stop across the street, a dog walker with 3 leads tangled around her arm, the world entirely unaware of what was happening in this phone call. Let me make sure I understand you, she said slowly. You're offering to permanently, legally remove yourself from your daughter's life, on paper, in exchange for one afternoon in a park. Yes. That makes no sense. I know how it sounds. Callum, you cannot. She stopped, rearranged. A legal relinquishment of parental rights is not a small document. It's not something you draft over a weekend. It has permanent implications. You understand that if you sign something like that, you cannot walk it back? I know what it means. Then why? She heard the sharp edge in her own voice and didn't smooth it. Why would you offer to erase yourself legally from her life in exchange for a single meeting? What does one afternoon get you that's worth that? Something I can't get any other way. Which is? He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, she heard something she hadn't expected. Not strategy, not the polished, composed executive voice she had come to associate with him across the conference table and the glass-walled offices. Something rawer than that. Something that sounded less like a man who had thought this through and more like a man who had arrived at a decision from somewhere beneath logic entirely. I need to see her, he said quietly. Just once. I need to see who she is. She did not say yes. She also did not say no. She told him she needed to think, ended the call, and stood in the car park for another 4 minutes after she put the phone in her pocket, long past the point where it was reasonable to stand in a car park. The offer didn't sit right. Not because it was overtly threatening. There was nothing in what he'd said that she could point to and name as manipulative. But she had spent 4 years developing very good instincts about what people wanted when they offered something large in exchange for something small, and the math of this proposition kept coming out wrong. A man with Callum Reed's resources did not need to offer a legal relinquishment of rights to secure a visit with his own child. If he had wanted to pursue this through official channels, he had the means to do exactly that. He was offering to disarm himself entirely before she had even shown him where the weapons were, which either meant he was exactly as genuine as he sounded, or it meant there was something in that one meeting he needed that she wasn't seeing yet. She wasn't sure which possibility concerned her more. She called him back 20 minutes later from her car before she started the engine. One more question, she said. And I want an honest answer. All right. If I said yes without the legal offer, if I just said yes, come and meet her, no documentation, no deal, would you still want to? A beat. Yes, the offer isn't about the meeting is about the meeting. He paused. The offer is about making sure you know I'm not here to take anything from you. I want her to know me because she chooses to, not because a court told her she had to. One meeting, she said. That's all I'm agreeing to. She told herself it was due diligence. That was the word she used in her own mind. Due diligence, the kind of reasonable professional verification any sensible person would conduct before allowing a relative stranger access to their child. It had nothing to do with the conversation in his office, or the phone call in the car park, or the specific way his voice had sounded when he said, I need to see her. Nothing at all. She started with the basics: LinkedIn, company bios, board profiles, the kind of professional record that was semi-public and easy to access. 3 years at Meridian Group as Chief Strategy Officer. Before that, a position at a mid-size investment consultancy in Chicago. Before that, 2 years overseas in London. His career trajectory was clean and linear, the kind that didn't require anyone to explain the gaps. She moved to news mentions, conference citations, Industry features. A quote in a finance publication from 18 months ago, where he had said something unusually candid about the pressure placed on young executives to value growth over integrity, and how he believed the best companies were run by people who understood the cost of that trade-off. She had stopped and reread that one twice. Then she searched his name alongside terms she told herself she was only entering professionally. The fourth result stopped her entirely. It wasn't a business profile or an industry feature. It was a charity registration. Callum Reed, founding director, the Forward Foundation. She clicked. The Forward Foundation. Established 3 years ago. Registered non-profit. Mission statement. Providing financial literacy, childcare support, and career development resources to single-parent households, with particular focus on professional women navigating re-entry into corporate environments after periods of primary caregiving. She read that sentence 3 times. The foundation had granted funding to 47 women in its first year. It ran a mentorship program. It had a scholarship stream for postgraduate study. The board was made up of professionals across law, finance, and education. There was a photo on the website from the previous year's annual luncheon. Callum at the podium, not performing charity for cameras, but speaking with the particular focus of someone who meant what they were saying. Below the photo, a caption with a quote from his address: "The cost of absence, whether chosen or circumstantial, is always carried by the person left behind. I built this because I needed to put that belief somewhere real." She sat back in her chair. The cost of absence. She thought about the $20 bill on the nightstand. She thought about the word absence, carrying that kind of weight for a person. She thought about the fact that he had started this foundation 3 years ago, which was approximately 1 year after Boston, which meant he had been building it almost since the beginning. She didn't know what to do with any of this. She closed the laptop and opened it again twice before she stopped. She was not softening. She was not revising. She was collecting information, the way she always collected information, methodically, without letting the conclusions form before the evidence was complete. That was all this was. She met Jonah Asher by accident on a Wednesday, in the kitchen on 31. He was making tea with the patient, deliberate method of someone who had opinions about steeping time, and she was waiting for the coffee machine to finish its cycle, and they had exchanged the small professional pleasantries of two people who don't yet know each other well enough to be comfortable with silence. Jonah was in legal. He had been at Meridian for 6 years, which made him, by the building's informal calculation, an institution. He knew where everything was filed and where every body was buried, metaphorically speaking. And he delivered this information with the casual ease of someone who had simply been present for long enough to accumulate it. They ended up talking for 15 minutes. She hadn't planned to bring up Callum. It happened the way things happen in conversations that have found their natural level. Jonah mentioned a long-running project that Callum had restructured 2 years ago, a project everyone had expected to fail that had become one of the company's better-performing divisions. "He's good," Jonah said, without particular feeling. "He's one of those people who's better at the job than you'd expect from someone who looks like that." "What does that mean?" Jonah smiled into his tea. "It means he has money, and he has cheekbones, and that combination makes people assume everything came easy. It didn't. He worked for it." He paused. "He's different now than he was when I first met him. When he arrived here 3 years ago, he was purposeful, like someone who decided something and was working through the implications of it." "Different how?" "Focused. Quieter than you'd expect. He doesn't talk about his personal life and nobody pushes it, because you can tell, whatever happened about 5 years ago or so, it changed the direction of something in him. He came out of it pointed at something." Jonah looked at her sideways. Not quite a question. "He's one of the better ones, for what that's worth." He finished his tea and left. Alara stood with her coffee and thought about the word purposeful. She found Charlotte on a Thursday evening, entirely by accident, from a link buried in an old conference attendee list she had accessed for a completely different reason. Charlotte Ames. Now Charlotte Ames Briggs. Profile set to semi-public. The kind of person who used social media the way people used to use Christmas cards. Infrequent, warm, genuinely personal without being revealing. She was married. 2 children, a boy and a girl, 3 and 5. The photos were easy and unstaged in the way that real happiness tends to look. not composed for performance, just life, ongoing and content. A birthday party in a backyard, a beach trip with adult friends who had clearly known each other a long time, a photo of Charlotte and her husband at some event, his arm around her, both of them mid-laugh at something off camera. She looked happy, solidly, genuinely happy. Not the performed happiness of someone making the best of things. The real kind, the kind that had its own foundation. Elara stared at the screen for a moment. She had constructed a version of Charlotte over the years without intending to, a peripheral figure in the story of Boston, more concept than person, wronged, a victim of the same circumstances Elara had been, just with the additional knowledge that she'd been engaged to the man who walked away. But Charlotte had moved forward, built something, arrived somewhere good. Elara closed the tab and sat with the quiet, strange feeling of a villain she had unknowingly cast, who had turned out not to be a villain at all. She almost didn't see him. It was 7:15 in the evening, and she was running later than intended, because Marcus had needed 40 minutes at the end of the day to walk through a projection discrepancy that turned out to be a formatting error, and by the time she reached the parking garage, it was mostly empty, the long, low-ceilinged kind that collected echoes and bad lighting in equal measure. Callum was by the elevator, not waiting for her. That much was clear from the way he turned at the sound of her heels on the concrete, the slight adjustment of surprise in his face. He had a jacket in one hand and his keys in the other, clearly also leaving later than intended. Elara! Callum! A beat where they both assessed the situation and reached the same conclusion simultaneously. The elevator was small, the wait was real, and there was no graceful alternative to standing here. Staying late? She asked. Board prep. You? Projection review. Another beat. The garage was very quiet. Their voices carried in the way voices do in spaces designed for cars rather than people. I've been thinking, she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. About the foundation. He went still, not uncomfortably, more like a person who was paying close attention and wanted her to know it. I looked it up, she said. The forward foundation. He said nothing for a moment. Then, okay. 3 years ago. Yes. She looked at him directly. Why didn't you tell me? When you were laying everything out in your office, the apology, the engagement, all of it, why didn't you mention it? He seemed to consider the question genuinely. Because I didn't want you to think I was using it, like a credential, like something I built to prove something to you. He looked at her with an expression that was quiet and very direct. I built it because I needed to. What you think of it is, that's separate. She absorbed that. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said quietly. I'm asking you to let me try. She agreed on a Sunday, not impulsively. She had spent 4 days after the parking garage, sitting with the decision the way she sat with any decision that had long-term consequences, which was to say, she examined it from every angle, listed the risks in a column on the left and the reasons in a column on the right, and then sat with the lists until she knew which one was actually true. The risks were real. There was no world in which introducing Callum Reed to Lila carried zero risk. He could confuse her. He could promise things he couldn't sustain. He could be exactly as genuine as he appeared and still cause damage simply by showing up and then disappearing again, which was a pattern she had direct personal evidence he was capable of. The reasons were also real. Lila had asked about her father in March and June and again 2 weeks ago over scrambled eggs. The answers that worked at 4 were already beginning to strain, and there was something else, something she acknowledged only to herself in the honesty of 3 in the morning, that Jonah's words had planted and the Foundation's website had watered, the possibility that she had been making decisions about Callum based on an incomplete version of who he was. She called him on a Sunday morning while Lila was watching her program. 1 meeting, she said. Riverside Park. Next Saturday, 2 o'clock. I will be there the entire time. The moment she is uncomfortable or you push any boundary I haven't given you permission to push, it's over. A pause. Thank you. His voice was quiet. No negotiation, no conditions. Thank you, Elara. She said, don't make me regret it, and hung up before he could respond. She told Lila on Friday evening during dinner. She had thought carefully about how to frame it. Not dishonestly, she wasn't going to tell Lila something she would have to walk back later. But 4 years old was not an age for the full weight of context. 4 years old needed something manageable, something warm, something that didn't arrive with more significance than it could carry. "There's someone I work with who's going to meet us at the park Saturday," she said over pasta. "His name is Callum." Lila looked up. "Is he nice?" "I think so." "Does he like dogs?" "I honestly don't know." Lila considered this as a potential character flaw. "We can ask him," she decided. She twirled pasta around her fork with the focused imprecision of someone still developing the mechanics. "What does he do?" "He works in my building. He helps make big decisions about the company." "Like a boss?" "Something like that." "You're a boss too," Lila said, with the confident certainty of someone who had settled this long ago and saw no reason to revisit it. "I'm working on it," Ilara said. Lila nodded approvingly and went back to her pasta. That night, after Lila was asleep, Ilara sat on the edge of her bed and held the weight of Saturday in both hands. It was either the right thing or a mistake. She wouldn't know which until it was already happening. He was there before them. She saw him from the park entrance, standing near the fountain, jacket on despite the warmth, hands in his pockets, very still in the way of someone who has been standing in one place for longer than was strictly necessary because moving felt worse. When he saw them coming, he straightened. Something in his face shifted, not composed itself exactly. More like it became very present, very there. Lila was holding Ilara's hand and pulling slightly, as she always did in spaces with things to run toward, already assessing the playground equipment over Ilara's arm. "Is that him?" "That's him." "He's tall." "He is. Hi." Lila released Ilara's hand and covered the last few feet to Callum with the fearless directness that belonged entirely to children who had not yet learned to be cautious of strangers, which was partly why Ilara had decided this setting. This level of involvement, these exact terms. Callum crouched down. He did it fluidly, which she noticed, because some adults performed crouching in a way that communicated discomfort with the whole enterprise. He did it naturally, bringing himself level with her without making a production of it. "Hi," he said. "I'm Callum." "I'm Lila." She said it with full confidence. "My mama says you work with her." "That's right." "Do you like dogs?" He blinked. "I do, actually. I had one growing up. His name was Archie." Lila processed this with visible approval. "Archie is a good name for a dog," she determined. "I want a dog, but Mama says we have to wait until I can help take care of it." "That sounds like a fair deal," Callum said. "I know," Lila agreed. "I just have to get bigger." Ilara stood 3 feet away watching this exchange with the specific sensation of having stepped into a moment she had been both dreading and, in some part of herself, she had not fully acknowledged, hoping for. Callum was holding it together. She could see exactly how much effort that was taking, the slight tension at the corners of his eyes, the deliberate steadiness of his voice. He was holding together by will alone. Lila was entirely unaware of this and had already moved on to showing him the playground. Lila had brought her notebook. This was not something Ilara had suggested or anticipated. Lila had decided, entirely on her own, that Saturday was a park day, and therefore a drawing day, and therefore the notebook was coming, and Ilara had not thought to question the logic until she watched Lila pull it from the small backpack and present it to Callum with the gravity of a curator opening a private exhibit. "These are my drawings," Lila announced. "I'll show you the good ones." "I'd like that very much," Callum said, and they sat together on the bench. Lila cross-legged, the notebook open across both their laps, Callum leaning in with genuine attention. "This one is our apartment," Lila said, pointing to a dense collection of purple and yellow marks. "That's the kitchen. Those are my rocks on the window." "You collect rocks?" "Only good ones. Not just any rock. You have to feel it first. To see if it's right." Lila looked at him sharply, like she hadn't expected him to understand that. "Yes, exactly." She turned the page. "This is Mama at work. She has a very big desk in this picture, but actually her desk is medium. I made it bigger so you could see her better." Callum looked at the drawing. At the purple figure with the very large hands and the medium desk that had been made larger for clarity. Elara watched him look at it. She watched the moment it registered, not just as a child's drawing, but as a drawing of a woman who had been doing this alone, who had a desk and a job, and a daughter who drew her larger than life because that was simply how she saw her. He pressed his lips together. He didn't look up for a moment. When he did, his eyes were too bright, and he knew it. And he made a small, specific effort to look at the next page before Lila could register what was happening on his face. "This one," Lila said, turning the page, "is a horse. I know it doesn't look like a horse, but it is." "I can see it," Callum said, and his voice was almost entirely steady. "Most people say it looks like a table. Most people aren't looking right." Lila beamed. It was the kind of smile that rearranged a room, the kind that arrived without calculation and landed without warning and was, as Elara knew from 4 years of direct experience, completely impossible to look at without feeling something shift inside you. Callum felt it. She could see that too. Lila had been studying him for the last few minutes the way she studied everything, openly, without embarrassment, with the particular focus of a child who has decided something is interesting enough to deserve her full attention. She put the notebook down on her knee. "Callum, yeah? You have sad eyes." The park continued around them. A dog barked somewhere across the path. A child on the climbing frame shouted something to a friend below. The world kept moving, unbothered. Callum didn't move. "Do I?" he said finally. "Like my mama sometimes, when she thinks I'm not looking." Lila said it without accusation or performance. She said it the way children state things they have simply observed and found true. "Are you sad about something?" He was quiet for a long moment. "A little bit," he said, "but I feel better today." Lila considered this, then patted his hand once with the decisive efficiency of someone who had delivered what comfort was required and was moving on. "Okay," she said. "Do you want to see the playground?" Elara had to look away. She looked at the fountain. She breathed. She did not let herself cry. Lila ran ahead to the climbing frame with the single-minded focus of a child who had been patient long enough and needed to move. They sat on the bench, side by side, close enough to keep eyes on the playground, far enough from the other parents not to be overheard. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "She's extraordinary," he said. Not effusive, quiet, like a statement of something observed and already known to be true. "I know," Elara said. "You did that. You built that person." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure what the right answer was, or whether one was needed. "I'm sorry," he said. And this was different from the apology in his office. That one had been prepared. This one was just the words, plain and unadorned, stripped of all the careful framing he usually put around things. "I know," she said again. They sat together in the complicated quiet of two people who had arrived at a place beyond argument and weren't yet sure what the territory ahead looked like. Lila turned around from the top of the climbing frame and shouted across the park, at full volume, with zero concern for surrounding families. "Callum, will I see you again?" She heard it first from Priya, not directly. Priya was too careful for direct, and too genuinely warm to want to be the person who delivered something unwelcome without softening it first. She mentioned it sideways, on a Tuesday, when they were walking back from a lunch run, and the office building was half a block ahead, and Priya slowed her pace by exactly the right amount to create a window. "I want to tell you something," she said, "as someone who is, I think, in your corner." "All right." "People are talking." Elara kept her expression neutral. "About?" "About you and Callum Reed." Priya glanced at her. "Nobody knows anything real, but you two were seen talking in the parking garage last week, and someone apparently saw you at Riverside Park on Saturday. Marcus, I think, running with his girlfriend, and the pieces people are putting together aren't accurate, but they're not flattering either." "What pieces specifically?" "That there's a personal history, that the reporting line was restructured because of it, that your hire was influenced." Priya said the last word carefully. "I don't believe any of that. I want you to know that. Your work is—" "Thank you, Priya." Elara kept her voice even. "I appreciate you telling me." She walked the remaining half-block in the comfortable silence Priya was gracious enough to offer. The rumor itself was not a surprise. She had known this building long enough, she had known any professional environment long enough, to understand that a restructured reporting line and two people with visible history operating 40 feet from each other would generate exactly this kind of speculation. You could not prevent it. You could only decide how to carry yourself through it. She carried herself through the lobby and into the elevator, and all the way to her desk, without changing her expression once. Greta requested the meeting in writing, which told Ilara everything before she walked through the door. Informal concerns arrived in person, in corridors, in the casual geography of a kitchen or an elevator. Written requests meant something was being documented, or at least positioned to be documentable if it needed to be later. She sat down across from Greta in the small internal meeting room. No windows, just frosted glass, the room used specifically for conversations that needed a degree of containment. "I'll be straightforward," Greta said. She always was. Ilara had come to appreciate this as one of her better qualities. "I'm hearing things from the floor. I'm not attributing them and I'm not repeating them. But I need you to know that they've reached me, which means they're further along than hallway noise." "I understand. Your work has been excellent. I want that on the record, clearly and first. Nobody is questioning your capability." She folded her hands on the table. "What I'm asking you to consider is appearances. Meridian Group works hard to maintain a culture of transparency and clear boundaries, especially regarding senior leadership. Any perception of irregularity in the circumstances around your hire, even unfounded, has a way of becoming something that needs to be formally addressed." "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to be mindful. Whatever is personal, keep it entirely separate." She paused. "And if there is something I should know, formally, I'd rather know it from you than read it in a complaint." "There's nothing you need to manage, Greta." "Good. Let's keep it that way." She appeared on a Wednesday at 11:40. Ilara knew who she was before anyone told her. Not because she looked like the social media photos. She did, but that wasn't why. It was the particular way she moved through the reception area, with the ease of someone who had been in this building before, who knew the geography of it, who had enough confidence in her right to be here that she didn't slow down to read the signs. Late 30s, well-dressed in the understated way of someone who had grown up being told that quality spoke for itself. Dark hair pulled back. A composure that matched Greta's, practical and genuine rather than performed. She gave her name at reception, and Ilara, passing through the lobby on her way back from a meeting, happened to be 3 steps away when she did. "Jessica Ames Briggs, I'm on the board. I'm here to see David Strand." The board. She was on the board. Ilara kept walking, did not stop, did not alter her pace, did not look directly at the woman standing at reception with the kind of deliberate avoidance that itself looks like something. She made it to the elevator, pressed 31, stood in the mirrored box and looked at her own reflection, and had the specific experience of understanding, very clearly, that the situation she was managing had a layer she had not accounted for. She had found Charlotte, now Jessica Ames Briggs, online. She had seen the photos of the backyard birthday party and the beach trip, and thought, with some relief, that here was someone who had moved forward and built something good, and was no longer part of this particular equation. She had been wrong. Jessica Ames Briggs was on the board of the company where Ilara worked, the same board that had oversight of senior hires. The elevator opened on 31. Ilara walked to her office, sat down, and spent 4 minutes simply looking at the wall and rearranging everything she thought she understood about her position here. The email arrived at 2:17 that afternoon. Not from Greta, not from Callum. From a board address, formal, clean, the kind of email that had been written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Ms. Calloway, my name is Jessica Ames Briggs. I'm a non-executive board member at Meridian Group with a portfolio that includes oversight of senior executive hires within the strategy division. I'd like to meet with you at your convenience to discuss the circumstances of your recent appointment and ensure all proper procedures were followed. This is a standard part of my role and is not a reflection of any concern about your professional qualifications. Please let me know your availability. J. Ames Briggs. Standard part of my role. Elara read the email 4 times. The language was careful, defensible. There was nothing in it that could be flagged as inappropriate. It read exactly like a board member conducting standard oversight of a divisional hire. On paper, it was entirely procedural. Off paper, it was the ex-fiancé of the man whose daughter she was raising, sitting on the board of her employer, requesting a meeting about the circumstances of how she got here. She looked across the corridor at Callum's closed door. She had come into this thinking the hard part was navigating what sat between her and Callum. The history, the child, the fragile and complicated trust they were cautiously building in the spaces around everything else. She saw now that she had been looking at the wrong edges of the problem. This wasn't just about her and Callum anymore. This was about a board member with access to her employment record. This was about a family she had never met, with the kind of resources that made institutional influence look like a phone call. This was about Lila. Her phone lit up on the desk. A message, unknown number. "We need to talk. It's about your daughter." She called the number back within the hour. She wasn't someone who sat on an unknown message about her child. Whatever it was, whatever the intent, she needed to know. Sitting with it was not an option she was willing to take. The number rang twice before a voice answered. Composed, measured, immediately recognizable from a single word. "Miss Calloway, thank you for calling. Jessica Ames Briggs." They agreed to meet off-site. Jessica had suggested a coffee shop 2 blocks from the building. A quiet place, she said, not somewhere either of them would see colleagues. Elara took that as both a good sign and a complicated one. They met at 4:30. Jessica was already there when Elara arrived. She had chosen a table at the back, away from the window, and she had a coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched. She stood when Elara approached, which was an unexpectedly courteous thing to do, and extended her hand. Elara, Jessica. They sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elara used the time to read her properly, the kind of reading she was good at, quick and thorough. Jessica was managing something. Not nerves exactly. She was too composed for nerves. More like the specific tension of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to say and was deciding where to begin. "I know this is unusual," Jessica said. "Meeting like this. I want you to know I thought about whether to reach out for quite a while before I did. You mentioned my daughter." "I know. I'll get to that." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I want to start somewhere else first, because if I start with your daughter, the rest of it sounds like a threat, and that's not what this is." "All right. I know who you are," Jessica said. "Not from the employment file. From before that. I've known about you since Boston." The coffee shop was quiet. The barista was doing something involving steam. A couple near the door were looking at something on a phone. The world was completely indifferent. "How?" Elara said, "Because Callum told me." Jessica's voice was steady. "Not everything, but enough. He told me something happened in Boston. He told me before he ended the engagement." Elara sat with that for a moment. "He told you?" "Yes." Jessica's expression held no anger, no residual bitterness. She spoke about it with the particular evenness of someone who had processed something fully and arrived somewhere clear on the other side. "He didn't tell me your name. He didn't tell me the specifics. He told me that something had happened at the conference that he needed to be honest about, and that it had made him realize things about himself, about us, that he couldn't continue to set aside." "And you?" "I was devastated," Jessica said simply. That would be dishonest to skip over. "I was devastated, and I was furious, and I went home to my mother's and I didn't speak to him for 3 months." She looked at her coffee, but in the months after that, when the hurt was less loud, I understood what he was actually telling me, that we had built something real and warm and safe and not enough, not for either of us. I think I had known that for at least a year before Boston. I had just been hoping we'd both keep choosing the familiar thing over the honest thing. "He said he looked for me afterward," Elara said. 6 months. "He did. I know because he told me that too. We were in better contact by then, trying to be the kind of people who could end things with honesty rather than resentment." She looked up. "He didn't find you." "No. And he didn't know about Lila until you walked into that interview room." No. Jessica nodded slowly. I didn't know about Lila either. Not until 3 weeks ago when someone on the board flagged your hiring and your surname came up in connection with Callum's, and I did the math myself. So, why are you here? Elara asked. You could have simply handled this from the board side, conducted your review, filed your notes, let it run its procedural course. Why the coffee shop? Jessica was quiet for a moment. Because I've met the Travers family, she said. It was the first time she had said it plainly, and the air in the room changed slightly. I was engaged to Callum for 8 months, Jessica continued. In those 8 months, I attended 4 family events, 2 of which were formal. I sat across from his parents at dinner more times than I cared to. I watched how they moved through the world, what they valued, how they viewed people who entered the family's orbit. She paused. They are not bad people, in the way that the most difficult people often aren't technically bad. They are people with a very specific idea of what belongs to them and what doesn't, and they are accustomed to having the resources to act on that idea. What does that mean for me? It means that the moment they found out Callum has a daughter, and they will find out if they haven't already, they will form a position about the child, about you, about what the appropriate arrangement looks like. She said, appropriate, the way people say words that mean something uglier than the syllables suggest. Are they dangerous? Not in any way that's dramatic, Jessica said. In a much more ordinary way. They're influential, they're patient, and they believe very strongly that blood is an asset to be managed. She looked at Elara directly. You need to know what you're navigating before it arrives at your door. I wished someone had told me before it arrived at mine. She laid it out in clear, factual terms, the way someone gives a briefing rather than a warning. The Travers family had built their wealth across 3 generations. Property, investment, a private equity arm that had expanded significantly in the past decade. They were not publicly prominent in the way that invited media attention. They operated in the quiet, well-connected register of old money that doesn't need visibility, because visibility has always been optional for people like that. Callum was their only son. He had, in many ways, distinguished himself from the family model. The foundation, the leadership philosophy, the deliberate distance he kept from the family's more transactional way of operating, but he was still their son. And that relationship, Jessica explained, came with architecture that was very difficult to fully step outside of. They have a family attorney who has been on retainer for 30 years, Jessica said. He doesn't wait to be called. He moves preemptively. That's his instruction. Protect the family's interests before they become problems. She set down her coffee cup. A grandchild who exists outside a sanctioned arrangement is exactly the kind of thing he would consider a problem requiring preemptive management. Jessica gathered her jacket from the back of the chair. I didn't fight for what I wanted, she said. I mean that in the broader sense, not Callum. I let that go with both hands when I understood what we actually were. I mean in life, with his family, with the expectations I let sit on my shoulders for 2 years without pushing back. I smiled, and I managed, and I kept the peace, and it cost me things I should have kept. She looked at Elara steadily. Whatever you want, for yourself, for your daughter, fight for it. Don't manage it, fight for it. She left. Elara sat alone with a coffee she'd forgotten to drink. They'll come for Lila. They always take what they think belongs to them. They came on a Saturday morning, which told her everything about the kind of people they were. Saturday morning was a choice, not a weekday, when the power dynamic of business hours might have favored them less cleanly. Saturday morning, when Elara would be home, would likely be in weekend clothes, would be in the middle of breakfast and small domestic routines that were designed for her life and not for the entrance of strangers. She heard the knock at 8:52. While Lila was at the kitchen table with her cereal and the stuffed animals she had arranged for a tea party that had not yet started, she opened the door. 2 people, both in their 60s, both dressed with the understated precision of people who had never in their adult lives owned anything that wasn't considered. The man spoke first. Ms. Calloway. Not a question, a statement of certainty about who she was. I'm Gerald Travers. This is my wife, Patricia. We're Callum's parents. I apologize for the early hour. We wanted to catch you before your day got away from you. She looked at them. She thought about Jessica's briefing. She thought about the family attorney on 30-year retainer. She thought about the word preemptive. You didn't call, she said. No, Gerald said pleasantly. We thought it might be better to come directly. She thought about Lila, 3 feet behind her, in her pajamas, eating cereal with a stuffed rabbit seated to her left. She stepped slightly to the side, filling the frame of the door with her body. Not aggressive, calm, deliberate. This isn't a good time, she said. I'd be happy to arrange something on a weekday. You can reach me through. We won't take much of your time, Patricia said. Her voice was warm, the specific kind of warm that was very well practiced. Just a brief conversation about what's best for everyone. She glanced past Elara into the apartment, briefly, one glance. Enough. Elara kept the door where it was. She did not let them in. She told Lila to stay at the table, stepped into the hallway, and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her. Whatever was about to happen, it was not happening in front of her daughter. Gerald Travers accepted this without visible objection. Patricia maintained her warm, patient expression. They had the practiced composure of people who had conducted many difficult conversations in many unlikely settings and had learned to treat every venue as a boardroom. We understand this is unexpected, Gerald began. And we want to be clear from the outset. We're not here to create difficulty. We're here because we believe, having become aware of the situation, that there is an opportunity to structure things in a way that benefits everyone involved. Structure things, Elara repeated. Financially, primarily. He said it without hesitation, the way people say things when they have long since lost the ability to hear how they sound. We're prepared to establish a trust for the child, for Lila, that would provide for her education, housing, medical needs, and long-term financial security at a level that would be, I think you'd agree, substantially beyond what the current arrangement can offer. And in return? A slight pause, the first crack in the smoothness. We'd ask for a formalized understanding, Gerald said. One that establishes clear parameters around how and when the child engages with the Travers family. Legal documentation that protects everyone's interests and ensures that the relationship is structured appropriately from the outset. Patricia added with the kind of gentleness that carried its own authority, This isn't about control, my dear. It's about security. For her. For you, frankly. Raising a child alone is, we understand it's difficult. We want to help make it less so. Elara stood in the hallway of her apartment and listened to the complete polished architecture of what they were offering. The trust, the framing of appropriate, the use of my dear, the timing of the Saturday morning arrival, the absent mention of what Callum wanted, the complete, absolute certainty that this was the kind of offer that would simply be accepted. She understood every moving part of it. She kept her face very still. When she didn't respond immediately, Gerald shifted, only slightly. The warmth in his tone didn't disappear. It thinned, the way warmth does when it has been performing a function, and the function hasn't worked. Miss Calloway, I think you're someone who understands how these situations tend to develop when they're not managed early. The legal landscape around paternity and grandparental rights has become more nuanced in recent years. Courts are increasingly attentive to the involvement of extended family, particularly when the extended family has demonstrable capacity to provide. Demonstrable capacity to provide, she said. Yes. He held her gaze. We'd simply hate for something that could be resolved amicably to become a matter of formal legal process, for everyone's sake, including Lila's. Patricia touched her husband's arm, the smallest gesture, and he settled slightly. What we want, Patricia said, returning to the warm register, is simply to know our granddaughter, to be part of her life in a way that is good for her. Is that so unreasonable? What you've described is not a request, Elara said. It's a proposal with a liability clause embedded in the 3rd paragraph. Neither of them responded. I understand what you've come here to do, she said. I want you to understand something in return. Lila is my daughter. She is not a situation to be managed or a relationship to be structured by people who weren't invited into her life. Whatever Callum and I decide together about what she needs, that will be between us. Not you, not your attorney, not a trust drawn up by someone on 30-year retainer. Gerald looked at her. We only want what's best for the child, he said. Then let her father and I decide what that is, she said. I think we're done here. Gerald reached into his jacket. She expected a card. It was a folded document. Brief, dense, the kind of thing that had been prepared in advance of this conversation. Consider this a courtesy, he said. So you have the full picture of what our legal team has prepared. There's no deadline. We simply think it's useful for you to understand the landscape. He held it out. She did not take it. He set it on the hallway windowsill, which was technically hers since it was her building, and stepped back. We'll be in touch, he said. Patricia offered a small, practiced smile. Please give our regards to Lila. We do look forward to getting to know her properly. Ilara said nothing. She watched them walk down the hallway to the stairs, both of them unhurried, both of them straight-backed, both of them carrying the particular confidence of people who expected resistance and had already accounted for it in their planning. The stairwell door opened and closed. She stood in the hallway alone for a moment. Then she picked up the document from the windowsill, went back inside, and checked that Lila was still at the table. She had abandoned the cereal in favor of giving the stuffed rabbit an imaginary cup of tea, and was explaining something to it in a very serious tone. Ilara went to the kitchen counter and opened the document. She read the first page. Then she picked up her phone. He answered on the second ring. Your parents were just here, she said. No preamble, no softening. They came to my apartment this morning, uninvited at 8:50, with a legal document and an offer and a very polite version of a threat. Silence. Then, what? His voice had dropped in the specific way voices drop when something has gone cold and still and past the point of composure. Callum, they came to my home. I didn't. A sharp exhale. Ilara, I did not know about this. I swear to you I did not know. She believed him. That somehow made it worse. That night, a courier arrived at her door. The envelope had a law firm's name in the corner. She didn't open it until Lila was asleep. If you have stayed with this story this long, you already know. This is so much bigger than two people trying to figure out what they are to each other. There is a little girl at the center of all of this who drew her mother larger than life because that's simply how she sees her. And there are people on the edges of this story who think she's something to be arranged. Subscribe, so you're here when we find out what Ilara does next, and tell me in the comments, do you think Ilara should let Callum meet Lila again now that you've seen what his family is capable of? I want to know exactly where you stand. The courier had arrived at 9:47. She had signed for the envelope without looking at the name in the corner, because she was holding Lila's cup in one hand and her phone in the other, and the evening had been long enough already. She set it on the counter and finished Lila's bedtime routine. Bath, the astronaut rabbit story, the glass of water that was always requested exactly when Lila was supposed to be closing her eyes. She opened the envelope at 10:23. It was 11 pages. The law firm's letterhead was clean and serious, the kind of serious that had been chosen deliberately because some firms brand themselves on gravity. She read the first page standing at the kitchen counter, in the quiet of a sleeping apartment. It was a petition, not from Callum, not in Callum's name, filed by Gerald and Patricia Travers, represented by their attorney of 30 years, asserting grandparental interest in the welfare and upbringing of one Lila Calloway, aged 4, on the grounds that the child's paternal family had been systematically excluded from her life. Systematically excluded. She set the document on the counter. She read those two words 3 more times. Then she called Callum. He arrived in 40 minutes. She had expected longer. He lived on the other side of the city. It was past 11. The traffic at this hour was unpredictable. He arrived in 40 minutes, which meant he had left within 2 of her call ending, which meant he had not deliberated or prepared or taken the time to construct a response. He had simply come. She let him in. He was in a dark jacket over what looked like clothes he had already changed out of once tonight. He had clearly been home, been settled, been somewhere that was not a crisis before her call made it one. She handed him the document without preamble. He read it, standing in her kitchen. She watched his face as he moved through the pages. He didn't read quickly. He read the way someone reads when they need to understand every word rather than the general shape of the thing. His jaw tightened on page 2. His hand, holding the document, went still on page 4. He put it down on the counter. He stood with his back to her for a moment. both hands pressed flat to the counter's edge, looking at the wall. Then he turned around. "I'm sorry." His voice was very quiet. Ilara, I am so sorry. I did not know they had instructed their attorney. I told them about Lila 2 weeks ago. I told them because I thought—" He stopped, rearranged. "I thought that if I told them myself, on my terms, with clear boundaries, they would respect those boundaries. I was wrong." "You told them about her?" "Yes, I should have discussed that with you first. That was my error." She looked at him. There was a difference between anger and exhaustion, and she had arrived, somewhere in the 40 minutes between his phone call and his knock on her door, at the specific place where the two met. She was both. She was neither. "Sit down," she said. "We need to talk about what happens now." He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the document between them. "I'm going to have my attorney respond to this by Monday," he said. "I'm going to make it unambiguously clear that I do not support this petition, that it was filed without my knowledge, and that I am formally opposing it. Whatever legal standing they believe they have, and grandparental rights petitions in this jurisdiction are not straightforward to begin with, I will be on your side of it." "That's a start," she said. "It's not enough." "I know," he said it without deflecting. "My parents have operated under the assumption that their preferences carry authority in my life," he said. "I have not done enough to disabuse them of that. I have managed them, worked around them, kept the peace in ways that were convenient for me and costly for other people." He looked at her directly. "I'm done managing them. I'm calling my father tomorrow morning, and I am telling him clearly that this petition is withdrawn, that any further contact with you or with Lila goes through me, and only through me, and that if they move forward in any way I have not explicitly agreed to, I will remove myself from their lives entirely." "Will you mean it?" "Yes." She studied him. "Callum, that's your family. Whatever they've done, they are still—" "They went to your apartment," he said, "on a Saturday morning, with a prepared legal document, to negotiate access to a 4-year-old they have never met." His voice was even, but there was iron underneath it. "They walked past every line I would want them to respect. Lila comes first. You come first. That's not a position I'm willing to revisit." She sat with that. The kitchen was quiet. Lila was asleep down the hall. "There's something else," she said. "Isn't there?" He looked at the table. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Before he started, "When I was in Boston," he said, "I woke up early. Before you. I lay there, and I looked at the ceiling for a long time before I got up." He was choosing his words with real care. "What I told you in the office was true. I panicked. I was with Jessica. I felt something I hadn't planned to feel, and I made a coward's choice. All of that is true. But there's a part I left out." He looked up. "I woke up that morning with a message from my father, sent at 6 a.m. He didn't know where I was or what had happened, but he had been trying to reach me the night before, and when I finally read what he'd sent, it was a reminder. That was the word he used. A reminder of the engagement dinner that was being planned for the following month, of the Ames family's expectations, of what the relationship meant for—" He stopped. He used the phrase, "the family's standing." He said it was important that I return from Boston focused. "The room was very still, and you read that," Ilara said slowly, "and you left." "I read that, and I made a decision that was about fear more than anything else. Fear of my father. Fear of the structure I had built my life inside of. Fear of what it would cost to choose something that hadn't been pre-approved." He exhaled. "I told myself it was the responsible thing to do, that I was protecting Jessica, protecting you from something that couldn't go anywhere. But the truth is I was protecting my place in my family's version of my life. And I have been ashamed of that specific thing for 5 years." He looked at her with nothing on his face except the plain, unguarded truth of it. "I was a coward," he said. "That morning in Boston. The 8 months I spent in an engagement I knew wasn't right. The year I spent being careful with my parents instead of clear with them. All of it was the same pattern, choosing what was manageable over what was honest." He leaned forward. "I am not going to do that now. Not with this petition. Not with my parents. Not with you." "Callum." "I know it doesn't undo anything. I'm not presenting this as payment for what I owe you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that the person who left that morning is not the person sitting at your kitchen table tonight." Before she could answer, a small sound came from the hallway. Lila, barefoot and blinking, appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Why is everyone yelling?" Nobody had been yelling, but Ilara understood immediately, looking at her daughter's face, that to a 4-year-old who had woken up to voices that weren't there when she fell asleep, the distinction didn't much matter. Ilara crossed the kitchen and crouched down to Lila's level. "Nobody's yelling, baby. We were just talking." Lila looked past her at Callum with the frank assessment of someone who was still deciding how much of this to believe. Callum had not moved from the table. He was very still. The careful stillness of someone who understood that moving in the wrong direction right now would be the wrong thing. "Is Callum staying?" Lila asked. "For a little while. You should be asleep. I heard voices." She said it as though this were a complete and sufficient explanation, which, in the logic of 4-year-olds, it was. She padded past Ilara to the table and pulled herself up into the chair beside Callum, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had decided he was familiar enough to sit next to. "Are you doing grown-up stuff?" she asked him. "Something like that," he said. His voice had shifted entirely, the gravity gone, something gentler in its place. "Grown-up stuff makes Mama's face do a thing," Lila said, with the observational precision that had been making Ilara simultaneously proud and unnerved, since Lila was approximately 2.5. "What thing?" Callum asked. Lila demonstrated a small, compressed expression that was, Ilara had to concede, a fairly accurate impression. Callum looked at Ilara. Ilara pressed her lips together. "It's very late," she said firmly, "and someone is supposed to be in bed." Lila did not move immediately. This was standard. She looked between the two of them with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to anything she had decided was worth understanding. "Are you and Mama sad?" she asked Callum. "A little," he said. Same answer he had given her in the park. Consistent, honest in the specifically appropriate way. "About the grown-up stuff?" "About some of it." Lila considered this for a moment, with the gravity of someone issuing a formal ruling. "You should be friends," she said. "When I'm sad at school, Miss Pereira says you should use your words and then be friends again." She nodded, satisfied with the logic of this. "Did you use your words?" "We're working on it," Callum said. "Okay." Lila apparently found this acceptable. "Being sad is tired," she added, as a final observation, and Ilara thought that was possibly the most accurate thing anyone had said in this kitchen all evening. She lifted Lila from the chair, and Lila went without protest this time, which meant she was more tired than she was letting on. "Say good night," Ilara said. "Night, Callum," Lila said, over Ilara's shoulder, already leaning. "Good night, Lila," he said quietly. She was almost asleep by the time they reached her room. Ilara settled her into bed, adjusted the blanket, reached for the book on the nightstand, The Astronaut Rabbit, which had been the standing request for 3 weeks. "Mama, can Callum read it?" Ilara paused. "You want Callum to read your story?" Lila nodded. Her eyes were at the particular half-mast that meant she had about 10 minutes of consciousness left and was spending them on something she had decided mattered. "He might not know this one," Ilara said carefully. "You can teach him," Lila said, with the unassailable confidence of someone who has never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with adequate instruction. Ilara looked at the doorway. Callum was standing just outside it. He had followed them down the hall at a respectful distance and was leaning against the wall in the corridor, not presuming anything. He had heard. She could tell from the particular quality of his stillness that he had heard every word. She looked at him. He looked back. She gave the smallest nod. He came in slowly, the way you enter a room that belongs to someone small and specific, quietly, without taking up more space than was needed. He pulled the chair from the small desk by the window and positioned it beside the bed. Ilara handed him the book. He looked at the cover. The Rabbit Who Wanted to Be an Astronaut. "Page 1, Lila instructed, from beneath the blanket. "We always start at page 1. "Understood," he said. He opened the book, cleared his throat once, and in a voice that was lower and softer than anything she'd heard from him across a conference table or through a glass wall, he began to read. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed. She told herself she would stay for a page, maybe two, and then give them the space and go back to the kitchen and think clearly about everything that still needed to be resolved. She told herself this, and then she didn't move, because watching Callum read a children's book to her daughter was something she had no framework for. She had frameworks for everything else. She had frameworks for anger and distance and professional composure and the specific endurance required for doing everything alone. She did not have a framework for this. He read it properly. Not the self-conscious performance of someone reading to a child in front of an audience, but actually reading it, following the rhythm of the sentences, giving the rabbit a small, earnest voice, pausing at the page where the rabbit reaches the moon and looks back at the earth below, and understands, for the first time, how large the world is. Lila was smiling with her eyes closed. He turned the last page. Read the final lines. Closed the book with a particular quiet of someone who understood that the ending was the most important part and deserved its own moment. Lila was asleep. He sat very still, looking at her. Ilara watched him look at her daughter, and she felt something in her chest make a slow, irreversible movement. Not falling exactly, more like a door that had been held against pressure for a very long time, finally, quietly, releasing from the frame. They stood together in the hallway outside Lila's room, the door left open the way Lila always needed it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I don't know how to do this," Ilara said finally. She wasn't talking about the legal document on the kitchen counter, or the petition, or the parents who had arrived at her door on a Saturday. She meant all of it. The entire complicated, unexpected shape of what was happening. He turned to look at her. "Neither do I," he said. "But I want to try." She looked at him for a long time. Then her phone rang. The meeting was called for Monday. She received the formal notification Sunday evening. A calendar invitation from the board secretary, flagged urgent, with a subject line that read, "Extraordinary Session Executive Ethics and Governance Review." Her name appeared in the supporting documentation as the subject of the review. The documentation cited concerns regarding the integrity of a recent senior appointment within the strategy division. She read it twice, forwarded it to the employment attorney she had called Saturday afternoon. She had been thorough enough to call one that morning, after the courier, before Callum arrived, and then she sat at her kitchen table with the quiet, methodical focus she brought to things that required clear thinking rather than feeling. She had known this was a possibility. Jessica had told her, in the coffee shop, that the Travers family had influence and patience and a preference for institutional mechanisms over visible confrontation. A legal petition at her apartment door on a Saturday was the visible move, the personal pressure. The board review was the institutional one. Both were pressure, just dressed differently. She arrived at Meridian Monday morning, 8 minutes early. She wore the charcoal blazer she had worn on her first day, because she had worn it on a day that required anchoring before, and it had held then. The boardroom was on the 40th floor. She had not been up there since her initial interview. It was a different world from 31. Quieter, more considered, the kind of space that communicated authority through restraint rather than volume. She sat in the chair that had been assigned to her and opened her portfolio. Whatever came next, she was prepared for it. Gerald Travers was seated at the far end of the table. She had not known he was on the board. She had known from Jessica's briefing that the family had influence at Meridian, but the specific, structural nature of that influence had not been fully clear until she walked into this room and saw him there, in the same careful suit he had worn to her apartment hallway, with the same pleasant expression that carried everything unpleasant underneath it. Patricia was not present. This was, Ilara noted, a deliberate choice. The soft warmth had served its function at the apartment door. Today was a different instrument. The chair of the board, a woman named Constance Hale, who had the no-nonsense composure of someone who had chaired difficult meetings across 30 years and had the patience for exactly none of their theatre, opened proceedings with a brief summary of the concern raised. Gerald spoke for 6 minutes. He was precise and fluent and scrupulously impersonal. He did not mention Lila. He did not mention his son. He spoke entirely about process, about the restructuring of reporting lines, about the compressed timeline of the hiring decision, about the question of whether sufficient independence had been demonstrated given the apparent prior relationship between the candidate and a senior member of the strategy leadership. Every word was legally defensible. Every word was designed to move toward one destination. Given these irregularities, he concluded, the board should consider whether Ms. Calloway's continued employment in this capacity is consistent with Meridian's commitment to transparent governance. Constance Hale wrote something on her notepad. Ilara kept her hands flat on the table. She had prepared for this. Greta had not been scheduled to speak. She was present in her capacity as head of people operations, a standard inclusion in any governance review of a hiring decision. She had been expected to provide documentation and answer procedural questions. Instead, when Gerald finished and the room opened for response, Greta set down her pen and spoke. "I want to address the substance of this review directly," she said, in the crisp, unhesitating tone of someone who had decided something before she walked into the room and was now simply executing the decision. Ilara Calloway was hired through a full, properly documented multi-stage process. Her application was reviewed by 3 independent assessors before it reached leadership. Her interview performance was evaluated on record as exceptional. The restructuring of her reporting line was initiated within 48 hours of a potential conflict being identified, and it was documented, disclosed, and implemented before her first day. She looked at Constance. Every standard was met. Every protocol was followed. I can provide documentation for each stage within the hour. She paused. What I cannot do is stand in this room and allow a process that was conducted correctly to be characterized as irregular without putting that characterization on record as, in my professional assessment, inaccurate. A silence. Gerald's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A slight recalibration, the kind that happens when a variable behaves differently than projected. "Thank you, Greta," Constance said. She meant it. He had not told her he was going to speak. She found out the same way everyone else in the room did. When he stood up, Callum had been seated at the table in his capacity as Chief Strategy Officer, which placed him 3 seats from Gerald, and directly in her eye line. He had said nothing through Gerald's 6 minutes. He had said nothing through Greta's response. He had written something on the notepad in front of him that she could not read from where she sat. When he stood, the room went still in the way rooms do when someone with authority over the space makes a physical claim of it. "I want to make a formal statement," he said. "For the record." Constance nodded. "I am Lila Calloway's father." He said it to the room, to the notepad writers, to the board members watching with varying degrees of surprise. He said it plainly, without apology, without the hedging language of someone managing a revelation. I became aware of this at the time of Ms. Calloway's interview. The restructuring of her reporting line was initiated by me immediately to protect against exactly the kind of conflict this review is suggesting occurred. I did not influence her hire. I removed myself from it. He looked at Gerald. I also want it on the record that I did not authorize, support, or have prior knowledge of the legal petition filed on the weekend in my daughter's name by members of my family. I am formally opposing it. Gerald looked at his notepad. Constance Hale called the vote 20 minutes later. 6-2. Ilara's position was affirmed. The review found no procedural irregularity sufficient to warrant action. She allowed herself 1 breath. But as the meeting closed and the room began to move, Constance held Callum back with a quiet word that Ilara was not meant to hear. She heard it anyway, because she was close, and because Constance did not raise her voice. "Your position, Callum, given the family connection on the board, we'll need to discuss the optics of that." Gerald Travers collected his papers at the far end of the table. As he passed the door, he looked back once. "This isn't over," he said. To no one specifically. To everyone. He found her in her office at 6:15 that evening. The floor was empty. Most people had left by 5:30, the board meeting having generated enough tension that the entire 31st floor had operated at a slightly lower volume all day. The way offices do when something large is happening above them that nobody has full information about yet. She was still at her desk, working, because work was what she did when the alternative was sitting with feelings that didn't have clean edges yet. He knocked on the glass door, which was the courtesy he always extended, even though the glass made it somewhat redundant. "You should go home," she said. "I wanted to talk first." He came in, sat in the chair across from her desk. Not the chair from the park bench conversation, not the kitchen chair from the night before. The professional chair, in the professional space, which was a choice she noticed. "I've drafted a resignation," he said. She looked up. "From Meridian, effective in 30 days. If my remaining on the board creates ongoing leverage for my parents, which it does, because my position here is part of what keeps the family invested, then my leaving removes the mechanism." He placed a printed sheet on her desk. "Your position is secure. The vote confirmed it. But as long as I'm here and they're on the board, there will be another attempt. A different angle. That's how they operate." She looked at the sheet without picking it up. "You built something real here," she said. 3 years. The strategy division's performance record is— "I know what I built," he said quietly. "I'm telling you, I'm willing to set it down." The story appeared Tuesday morning. She found out from Priya, who sent a message at 7:42 that said only, "Have you seen the news? Call me before you come in." She looked it up from her kitchen table while Lila ate breakfast. It was a business gossip site first, the kind that dressed corporate speculation in the language of journalism. The headline was careful enough to avoid direct legal exposure while communicating everything it needed to: secret heir, Meridian's strategy chief and the single mother he hired, a board battle, a child, and questions of ethics. By 8:15, 2 larger outlets had picked it up. By 9, her phone had received 4 calls from numbers she didn't recognize, which she declined in sequence while dropping Lila at preschool with the particular hollow calm of someone operating on the part of the brain that handles logistics, while the rest of it processes something it hasn't finished processing yet. The story had details that were not publicly available. The board vote, the specific restructuring of her reporting line, the custody petition filed by the Travers family. These were not things that could have come from a journalist who had done their own digging in 48 hours. These had come from inside the room. She called her attorney from the preschool car park. "Can we trace it?" "Unlikely, but the source is evident enough from the specifics." "Gerald Travers?" "Almost certainly." She sat in the car for a moment after ending the call. The morning was bright and completely indifferent to everything happening inside it. A woman walked past with a coffee and a dog on a very long lead. She picked up the phone and called Callum. "I've seen it," he said before she finished saying his name. "Tear up the resignation," she said. "Ilara?" "Tear it up, Callum." She kept her voice even. "Certain. I've thought about this since you put it on my desk last night, and I've arrived at the same answer every time. You resigning does not solve the problem. It removes you from the board equation, but it doesn't remove the Travers family. They will find another lever. They will find another mechanism. And what you will have done is handed them a visible victory and taken yourself out of every room where decisions about our daughter's future might be made." A pause. "Beyond that," she said, and this was the part she had thought hardest about, "I will not be the reason you give up something you built. I walked into your building on my own terms. I will stay or leave on my own terms. That is not a decision I'm putting in your hands, and it's not something I will carry the weight of." He was quiet. "So, what do we do?" He asked. "We stop reacting," she said. "They've been setting the terms of this since your parents knocked on my door. We've been responding. The emergency meeting, the boardroom, the resignation draft, all of it is reactive. We need to get ahead of it." She looked through the windscreen at the bright, indifferent morning. "We tell our own story," she said. Before they finished telling theirs, they met that evening at her kitchen table, which had become, without either of them formally deciding it, the place where the serious conversations happened. Her attorney joined by phone. Callum had spoken to his own counsel in the afternoon. Priya had offered, quietly and without being asked, to loop in a communications contact she trusted from a previous role, someone with experience navigating exactly this category of corporate meets personal media situation. The communications contact, a woman named Denise, was brisk and clear and did not soften things unnecessarily. "The story as it currently exists," Denise said, "has 2 problems. First, it's incomplete, which means it's being filled in by speculation and by whoever is feeding the press. Second, the framing is adversarial. It positions this as a scandal rather than a human story. Both of those problems have the same solution. "We complete the story ourselves," Ilara said. "You complete the story yourselves. A joint statement won't be enough at this point. The board leak has given the story enough momentum that a written release will be treated as damage control rather than substance. You need to be visible." "A press conference," Callum said. "A press conference. Short, focused, honest." Denise paused. "Not a performance. The only thing that cuts through the noise at this point is something that sounds like two actual people being truthful about a complicated situation. If you try to spin it, they'll find the seams. If you're honest, there's nothing left to uncover." They spent 2 hours building the framework. What to say, what to hold back, how to speak about Lila without making her a prop in a story she hadn't consented to be part of. By the time they finished, it was past midnight. The statement went out at 7 the following morning, ahead of the press conference. It was 1 page. It said that Callum Reed and Ilara Calloway were the parents of a 4-year-old daughter, that the circumstances of their daughter's birth were private and had been navigated between them directly, that Ilara's employment at Meridian Group had been subject to a full governance review which had confirmed the integrity of the hiring process, that they were committed to co-parenting their daughter with respect and consistency, and that they asked for privacy for their child, who was 4 years old and had done nothing to deserve public attention. It was signed by both of them. The final line read, "We are not a scandal. We are 2 people trying to do right by a child who deserves better than the noise surrounding her." The press conference was scheduled for the next morning. She was up at 5:15, not because she had set an alarm, because she had not slept past 5 in the morning since the preschool car park and the first news alert, and her body had apparently decided that 5:15 was now simply when the day started, regardless of what she felt about it. She showered, made coffee, stood in her bedroom for longer than was strictly necessary looking at the 2 outfits she had laid out the night before, and understanding that the choice between them was also a decision about how she wanted to be seen, not by the press, but by herself. She wore the navy dress she had bought for her first major client presentation 5 years ago. Not the charcoal blazer. That was armor. Today required something different, something that said she had arrived at this moment and was standing in it, not defending against it. Callum arrived at 7 to drive them in. He knocked. She opened the door. He was in a dark suit, no tie. Another choice, she registered. Considered, but not stiff. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she said. "Me neither." She picked up her bag. "Denise said to keep the answers short," she said, as they walked to the elevator. "Short and honest, I remember. And if they ask about Lila directly, I know what to say. We agreed last night." She pressed the lobby button. The elevator descended. She had almost forgotten to mention the morning's earlier conversation. She told him in the car because the alternative was sitting with it alone, and she had discovered over the past 2 weeks that things sat better when she said them out loud. "Lila asked me something this morning," she said. He glanced at her from the driver's seat. "What?" "She asked if you and I were going to get married." A pause. "What did you say?" I said, "That was a big question for 7 o'clock in the morning." Ilara looked out the window. "She said that Rosie's mummy and daddy are married, and they all live in the same house, and she wanted to know if we were going to do that." What did she seem like she wanted the answer to be? Ilara was quiet for a moment. "She said it the way she asks if we're going to get a dog," she said. Hopeful, but like she'd already prepared herself for a practical reason why not. He didn't respond immediately. He watched the road. "She's 4, and she's already managing her own expectations," he said quietly. "That one's on me." "It's on both of us," she said. "Let's get through today." There were more cameras than she had expected. Denise had told her to expect interest, that the combination of corporate governance and private family story was the specific mixture that generated heat in a news cycle. Knowing this, and standing in front of it, were different experiences. The room was a mid-sized conference space at a hotel 3 blocks from the Meridian building. Neutral ground. Denise's instruction. Not a corporate backdrop, not a personal setting. somewhere that belonged to neither of them, which meant neither of them was defending territory. They stood side by side at the podium. She spoke first, because they had agreed she should, because this story had always been more hers to tell than his. "My name is Ilara Calloway," she said. "I'm a financial restructuring specialist, and I have been employed at Meridian Group for several weeks in a senior capacity. I'm also a mother. My daughter is 4 years old. Her name is Lila, and she is the person in this situation whose well-being matters most, so she is also the person I will not be providing details about beyond what is necessary." A pause, cameras clicking. 5 years ago, I met Callum Reed briefly. We lost contact. I did not know he worked at Meridian when I applied for my position, and I did not know he would be in the interview room when I arrived. The governance review that was conducted at board level last week confirmed that my hiring was procedurally sound. I am not going to relitigate that. The board has spoken. She looked up from the paper she had not actually needed, because she had memorized this. What I will say, the thing that isn't in any document or review or press release, is that none of this has been simple. Being a single parent is not simple. Navigating a professional environment while managing a personal situation of this complexity is not simple. I have not handled every moment of the last several weeks perfectly, and I'm not standing here to claim otherwise. She paused. But I am standing here, and I'd like to keep standing here, doing work I am qualified and committed to do, raising a daughter I love completely, and navigating the rest of it with the same honesty I'm trying to bring to this room today. Callum spoke next. He spoke about accountability, about the specific failure of a man who had let fear make decisions that should have required courage, about the foundation he had built and why, about his daughter, briefly, warmly, without performance. He said she was remarkable and that he was still learning what it meant to deserve a place in her life. One journalist asked if the Travers family's legal petition would proceed. Callum answered without hesitation. "No," he said, "it will not." Denise found her in the corridor afterward and held up her phone. "You need to see this." It was a post, Jessica Ames Briggs, on her personal account, which she used infrequently and without the performed enthusiasm of someone curating a public image. It was 3 sentences. "For what it's worth, I know both people who spoke today. I know the character of both of them from a perspective that is probably unique. Whatever the noise says, these are 2 people trying to do something hard with integrity. That deserves to be said clearly and publicly, so I'm saying it." That was all. No elaboration, no press contact, no statement to any outlet. Just 3 sentences on a personal account, from a woman who had every reason to stay out of it and had chosen not to. Ilara read it twice. Denise was watching her face. "She reached out to me this morning," Denise said quietly. "Asked if it would help. I told her only if it was genuine." A pause. She said it was. Ilara handed the phone back. She thought about the coffee shop, about the advice delivered over an untouched cup, about a woman who had decided that doing the right thing was more important than doing the comfortable thing. "Thank you, Jessica," she said, to no one in the corridor. To the general principle of unexpected decency, by mid-afternoon the story had shifted, not completely. It never does completely, and she was clear-eyed enough not to expect that. But the initial framing, the scandal angle, the ethics question, the breathless secret air language of the first wave of coverage, was being pushed back by something else. The press conference footage was circulating, not the hostile version, the human version. The 2 minutes where she had stood at a podium and said she was a single parent who had handled things imperfectly and was still standing. That clip specifically had found the kind of traction that authentic things sometimes find when they appear in spaces expecting performance. The comments were unexpected, not universally kind, because the internet is the internet and nothing is universally anything. But the dominant current was not what Gerald Travers had apparently anticipated when he gave a board meeting's confidential details to a business gossip site. People were, in the main, on her side. A number of the most shared responses were from single mothers, from people who had navigated complicated co-parenting arrangements, from people who simply found a woman standing up and saying, "This is hard, and I'm still here," more compelling than whatever narrative had originally been constructed. Denise sent a summary at 4 o'clock. "You did well. The cycle is turning. Hold the line." She was still reading it when Callum appeared at the door of the small side room where she had retreated. "There's something I need to ask you," he said. She had expected something practical, a logistics question about next steps, or a note from their attorneys, or something related to the board situation that hadn't resolved itself in the press conference's clean, controlled hour. She had expected the professional voice, the focused, organized one she had come to know across glass walls and conference tables. Instead, he closed the door behind him and stood with his back against it, jacket in hand, looking at her with the expression she had seen only a handful of times. In the conference room when she said, "She's 4, in the park when Lila showed him the drawing of a purple figure with large hands, in her kitchen when he said, "Neither do I, but I want to try." The expression that had nothing performed in it. "I have thought about you," he said, "since the morning I left. Not occasionally, not in the way that you think about things from your past when something reminds you, actively, regularly, in the specific way that means something has stayed with you because it was supposed to stay with you." She didn't speak. "I told myself for 2 years that it was guilt," he continued, "that what I was carrying was the weight of a choice badly made, and that what I felt was accountability rather than anything else. But I built a foundation whose entire purpose was to address the cost of absence, Ilara. You don't build something like that out of guilt. You build it out of something that has changed the way you understand the world." He moved from the door, sat in the chair across from her with his forearms on his knees, the same posture he had taken in his office the evening she agreed to the after-hours meeting, the same posture he seemed to default to when he was being honest without a script. "I never stopped," he said simply. "I tried, and I never managed it." She was quiet for long enough that the room held it comfortably. Then she said, "I looked you up." He stilled. "Not right away. The first year I didn't. I was busy surviving it, which didn't leave time for anything else. But after, when Lila was 1, when she started walking, and she had this specific way of tilting her head to one side when she was thinking about something, and I knew the gesture wasn't from me." She looked at her hands. "I searched your name, found the consulting firm you were at in Chicago, found your LinkedIn, found one conference photo, and closed the browser, and didn't look again for 4 months." She glanced up briefly, then looked again, then closed it. "I stopped counting after the 5th or 6th time." She exhaled. "I wasn't looking to contact you. I want to be honest about that. It was never that I was working up to reaching out. I think I was just checking that you were real, that the person existed, that Lila came from something real and not just from a night and a note." He looked at her steadily. "She came from something real," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I think I knew it then too, which is probably why I kept looking." The room held all of it without comment. The years of separate lives, the parallel weight of carrying something unresolved. 2 people who had been more present to each other at a distance than either had fully admitted. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know before I do that there is no pressure attached to it. Whatever your answer is, I will respect it. Entirely. The CO parenting arrangement, Lila's involvement in my life, none of that changes based on what you say. That's separate. That's already decided." "Ask," she said. "Can we start over?" He said it plainly, not with the careful, constructed language he sometimes used when he was managing something difficult. Just the words. Not as CO parents navigating a legal situation, not as colleagues trying to maintain professional distance across 40 feet of glass. As 2 people. He paused. "As us. Whatever that looks like when it's honest and chosen rather than accidental and complicated." "It was never just accidental," she said. "Even in Boston. I know you know that." "I know," he said, "which is why I'm asking." She looked at him, at the face that her daughter had partially inherited, at the person who had read the astronaut rabbit story with a small, earnest voice, at the man who had stood in a boardroom and said her name publicly and opposed his own family on record, at the person who had built a foundation for women in situations like the one he had left her in, and had not told her about it because he didn't want credit for it. "It's not a simple ask," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Nothing about this has been simple, but I think we've both proven by now that simple wasn't what either of us actually needed." She almost smiled. "That might be the most accurate thing you've said in 2 weeks," she said, but the almost smile faded. Because the honest thing had to be said too, and she had committed, to herself, to Denise's press conference advice, to the general principle that had been getting her through the last several weeks, to honesty over management. "I'm afraid," she said. He waited, "not of you specifically, of this, of letting something in that has the capacity to leave again." She said it without accusation. It was simply true. "I have spent 4 years building something that doesn't have gaps in it. I am not fragile. I want to be clear about that. I am not someone who needs protecting, but I have made myself sufficient. And inviting someone into that, really inviting them, not co-parenting arrangements and supervised park visits, but genuinely, means accepting that I could lose something." "You could," he said honestly. She looked at him. "I'm not going to promise you certainty," he said. "I think we're both too clear-eyed for that to be worth anything. What I can tell you is what I intend, and what I intend is not to be the person who leaves." She absorbed that. "I need time," she said. He nodded, not with resignation, with the specific acceptance of someone who had asked an honest question and received an honest answer, and understood that an honest answer was more valuable than any other kind. He stood, picked up his jacket. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. He turned back once. "Just enough. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worth the risk, Elara, whether you ever decide I am or not." He left. She sat in the quiet room with her hands in her lap and let herself feel every complicated, hopeful, terrifying thing in it. "I need time," she had said. But even as the words sat in the room after him, she was already aware, in the specific way that the body knows things before the mind catches up, that the answer had already begun. 6 months changes the shape of things. Not always, not automatically. But when you have been deliberate about what you're building, 6 months is enough to see the outline of it clearly. Elara's first major project at Meridian Group closed in month 4, a restructuring of a subsidiary's debt position that her team had spent 11 weeks working through, which landed 3 weeks ahead of schedule and significantly above the target outcome. Constance Hale had sent a personal note. Greta had forwarded it to the division record. Marcus had been difficult for the first 6 weeks. Then he'd seen her work. Then he'd stopped being difficult in the specific, visible way and started being difficult in the much less consequential way of someone who respected you but would never say so out loud. She could work with that. Priya had become something that was moving, steadily and without ceremony, toward genuine friendship. They had coffee twice a week, usually on Wednesdays, usually running 15 minutes longer than intended because they both lost track of time when the conversation found its level. Rowan had left at month 3 for another firm. She had wished him well and meant it. The office across the corridor was still Callum's. The glass walls were still glass. They still saw each other every day, in the particular way of people who share a floor and have navigated a very great deal together. It was not simple, but it was real. And real, she had decided, was worth more than simple. He was consistent. That was the thing she had not been certain of. Not because she had thought he would be careless, but because consistency required showing up for ordinary days, not just significant ones, and significant ones were easier to show up for. He showed up for ordinary days. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Lila went to Callum's apartment after preschool. This had been Elara's suggestion, cautiously made and carefully framed, and he had accepted without negotiating the terms she offered or pushing for more. He had simply said yes and arranged his Tuesdays and Thursdays accordingly. He had moved apartments 3 weeks into the arrangement, to a building 12 minutes from Elara's, which he had mentioned practically and without making it a declaration. She had noted it and said nothing, because it was practical, and that was how she chose to receive it. Lila had shown him her rock collection on the 3rd Tuesday. By the 4th, he had been shown where to stand at the windowsill to see which rocks caught the light the best. By the 6th, she had given him one, a grey river stone with a flat bottom and a faint line through the middle that Lila had determined was the kind you have to feel first. He kept it on his desk at work. She had seen it there one morning from across the corridor and had stopped looking at it after a moment because it did something in her chest that she wasn't fully ready to catalogue. Lila called him by his name. Not Dad, not yet. She had gotten there on her own timeline for everything else, and Ilara trusted she would get here the same way. But she talked about him daily, with the casual familiarity of someone who had decided he was a permanent feature of her world. He was. Time had lasted 3 weeks. Not because she had rushed herself. She hadn't. 3 weeks was what it took. At the pace she set, moving through the specific inventory of fears she had been honest about in that hotel corridor, and examining each one with the same methodical attention she brought to a financial restructuring. The first date had been dinner. Her suggestion, neutral ground, a restaurant neither of them had been to, away from the building, away from the neighborhood where Lila's world was, a place that belonged to neither of them, because that was where they needed to start. They had talked for 3 hours, not about the custody situation, which the Travers family had quietly withdrawn from after a brief and apparently definitive conversation between Callum and Gerald, that Callum described only as necessary, and she had chosen not to push on the specifics of, not about the board, or the press, or the past 2 months. They had talked about things that mattered, without being about the situation. He told her about the year he spent in London, and the small apartment in Shoreditch where the heating only worked if you hit a specific radiator panel in exactly the right place. She told him about the period after Lila was born, when she read an entire book a week, because the nights were long, and the reading made her feel continuous, like a person who still had an interior life beyond logistics. He listened to the reading detail with the focused attention he gave everything she said. "What were you reading?" he asked. She told him. He had read 3 of the same books. It was not a dramatic discovery. It was a small one. But small things, she had learned, were where the real architecture of trust was built. Not in grand gestures or press conference solidarity, but in the ordinary, unremarkable evidence that 2 people had moved through the world with some of the same interior and arrived by separate roads at the same place. The second date had been easier. The third had felt, quietly and without announcement, like something that was simply continuing. Lila turned 5 on a Saturday in March. She had requested a party with a purple theme, a cake shaped like a rabbit, and the attendance of her stuffed animals as guests, who were to be given their own chairs. These requests had all been accommodated. The apartment was full by midday. Ilara's mother had arrived from Florida the previous Thursday and had spent 2 days making herself thoroughly at home, reorganizing the kitchen into a configuration. Ilara would spend a week returning to normal and loving Lila with the specific totality of a grandmother who had been missing her. Ilara's friend Dana and her husband were there, the ones who had offered to help with boxes the year she moved and had been declined. They had come today without being asked, because that was the kind of people they were. Priya came. She brought a book, a beautiful one, with illustrations Lila immediately announced were the right kind. Callum came. He arrived with a box that turned out to contain a telescope, small, appropriate for a 5-year-old, with a card that said, "For the girl who already knows how big the world is. Here's further." Lila had screamed with delight in a way that made the stuffed animals at their table look understated by comparison. Ilara watched the room from the kitchen doorway at some point in the middle of the afternoon, her mother laughing at something Callum had said, Priya helping Lila figure out the telescope, Dana's husband being recruited into a game whose rules Lila appeared to be inventing in real time. She looked at the people in her living room and understood, quietly and completely, that she had built something, not perfect, not conventional, not the shape she had once imagined, the right shape. He said it first. They were in the kitchen after the guests had gone. Lila was asleep in her room. The telescope beside her bed pointed vaguely at the ceiling. The apartment was softly wrecked with birthday party evidence, empty cups, a deflated balloon, purple ribbon on every horizontal surface. They were doing dishes. Not romantically, practically, because the sink was full and someone had to. He handed her a washed cup, and she was reaching for it, and their hands overlapped on the handle, and he looked at her and said, "I love you." Plain, quiet, no preamble. She held the cup. She looked at him. At the face she had looked at across conference tables and through glass walls and in her kitchen at midnight with a legal document between them. At the person who read astronaut rabbit stories and kept a riverstone on his desk and had driven across the city in 40 minutes on a phone call that needed him. She set the cup down. "I love you too," she said. He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath for a very long time. "I know," she said softly. "I kept making you wait for it." "It was worth it," he said. "You were worth it." There is no version of a story like this that ends with everything resolved. What there is, 6 months out from a conference room and 5 words that detonated 4 years of silence, is this: a woman who walks into the same building she walked into that first morning, badge clipped to her lapel, 12 minutes early, carrying nothing she didn't choose to carry. A man who keeps a riverstone on his desk and shows up on Tuesdays and Thursdays and 1 or 2 other days besides, because he has learned that consistency is not a rule. It's a decision you remake every day. And a 5-year-old with a telescope pointed at a ceiling, waiting to see further. Once upon a time, a woman walked into a building carrying a secret. She walked out carrying hope. And that made all the difference. If this story landed for you, if you found yourself somewhere in it, in Ilara's quiet exhaustion, or Callum's too late realization, or even in Lila's uncomplicated, devastating wisdom, then you already know why these stories matter. Second chances are rarely clean. They come with history and hesitation, and the very real risk of getting it wrong again. But sometimes the bravest thing 2 people can do is choose each other anyway, eyes open, fully informed, without the protection of ignorance. Tell me in the comments, do you believe in second chances? Not the easy kind, not the ones that cost nothing. The real kind, where you have to rebuild something from the actual rubble. Want to hear from you. And if you've been here from the beginning of this story, if you've watched Ilara and Callum and Lila find their way to that kitchen and those dishes and that quiet "I love you," thank you, genuinely. Subscribe if you haven't, because there are more stories where this one came from, and I want you in the room when I tell them